Chapter 821. The Essence of Law. It's nothing more than a tool for class rule. It's the embodiment of the will of the ruling class. It's a method for the rulers to regulate all sorts of social behaviors. In a certain country, in a certain world, any law scholar would learn about the essence of law when they first started studying jurisprudence. Perhaps it was because this country was deeply influenced by the ideology of the hammer and the sickle. Their definition of the essence of law was filled with class warfare. Law is the tool of the ruling class. In that country, this was the public opinion, the orthodoxy, the final conclusion. In fact, most law scholars and professionals viewed this as the truth. But this wasn't everything. At the very least, I didn't believe that this was everything. Obviously, this type of conclusion would only become reality after countries and social classes appeared. But if society structure wasn't complete, such as a primitive society without written or systematic laws, then wouldn't the most basic social principles be considered law? And in this world where so many species coexisted, the concepts of law from the old generation were constantly being challenged. For example, the silver dwarves strangely achieved equality for all species. They had no officials or tribe leaders, but even stranger was that they abnormally strictly obeyed the tribe's rules. In that case, since there wasn't even a ruling class, the classical concept of law based on class was nothing more than a joke. For example, the ant tribe, which was a minority species, all of them lived for the ant queen and served the ant queen. However, the ant tribe actually didn't have any sense of self. They successfully combined all of their wills into a single entity. Since there was only one ant tribe member, it was difficult to say who ruled who. It was also quite common for the ant queen to be sacrificed. For example, the undead tribe, which was composed entirely of dead people, or the dragons, which had an even stranger social structure. Such situations were quite common. In this world, the elves and humans had strict and careful societies, while the nobles and commoners were the minority. I couldn't even count how many societies were even stranger than the silver dwarves. Since most species hadn't even established their own countries yet, it would obviously be a joke to continue using the concept of class as the foundation of law. If such a foundational law was still used, then the evil laws are also laws argument from my previous world would only become more and more intense, to the point where it would become impossible to resolve. Abstract theories might be difficult to understand. But for example, if the tyranny of a tyrant, the internal system of a terrorist organization, and the unspoken rules of a killer society were also recognized as laws, then the newly born power of law would become the most powerful weapon in the hands of villains and tyrants. Although this seemed like an abstract theoretical thought, explaining the essence of law was actually giving the concept of law a definition. Law was the source of the power of law's birth and development, just like how holy light was defined as purification. To H.E., who had the power of willpower, a careless thought was definitely a disaster. If there was a problem with the foundation, even if the superstructure did not collapse, it would grow askew sooner or later. Could it be that the law is only a basis for ruling? Could his social function of leading people to do good and punishing villains be simply explained as a function of maintaining social stability? Perhaps that kindness and social function is its true nature. Finally, when it came to the codex of origins of this world, I gave up on the classical theoretical system that had once been the Bible. Instead, I proposed my own personal understanding of the law based on the unique characteristics of this society. He should lead people to do good. From this moment onward, the H.E. Codex was completely different from any other country's codex. Evil laws are also laws. Such a dispute would never occur from the very start. The tyrant's evil laws were excluded from the codex from the very start. He should treat every criminal equally. From that moment onward, the power of law would only act based on the criminal's crime. It wouldn't be biased based on the criminal's identity or power level. He should be limited to divine laws and human laws after I finish defining the laws one by one, I discovered to my astonishment that an action that had been despised by human society back in the olden days became the best explanation for my law. It's actually bloody and primitive revenge of the same kind. Perhaps the term revenge of the same kind was a legal term, but the actual meaning was quite simple. An eye for an eye and blood for blood. Those who harmed or killed would be treated the same way no matter how many evil deeds they committed. Those who gouged out their eyes would have their eyes gouged out, and those who killed would be killed. In primitive tribal societies, the majority of the time, the victim's blood relatives would take revenge. That was why this had another name, blood revenge. Since it was far too barbaric and cruel, it had long since been eliminated by modern countries. But perhaps it was precisely because this world was far too cruel and barbaric that my power of law appeared in this world. Law used even crueler methods to threaten villains. Even if the villains managed to avoid judgment while they were alive, they would still be punished afterward. There would be no exceptions. Law gave the victims the right to take revenge. When the villains' actions were exposed to the light, when the codex of the river Styx recorded the mortals' experiences, their heavy crimes would finally transform into a noose that would strangle them to death. Law gave the innocent and the weak a necessary sense of security. That was because the villains' severed heads were still hung high on the city walls, shocking the people who came after them. Law gave the victims the right to take revenge. They were the protectors of the weak and the weak. They were the protectors of the weak and commoners, as well as the executors of vengeance for the victims. It was quite obvious that this was quite extreme, bloody, barbaric, and unreasonable. But in this cruel world, if I continued to use modern law, then even the death penalty was being abolished. The peacetime laws that could be bailed out with money were the true idiots that didn't fit this era. To give the simplest example, if I continued to use the laws of the olden generation as the foundation of law, then my Justice Knight would have to act just like the olden generation's police, even if they encountered an evil act of murder. They would first gather evidence and testimony, and then bring the criminal to court for a fair trial. In a way, they would even be inferior to the olden generation's police, because the power of law was far more inflexible and foolish than the current system. It was also worth mentioning that the death penalty was one of the few examples of revenge in the modern era. Murderers must pay with their lives. This was common knowledge in traditional and primitive societies, but it had already been rejected by many countries. The ever more complicated laws actually gave the unforgivable villains a chance to do evil again. In this world where resources were limited, this was far too wasteful. Chaotic times require severe punishments. This world is even more chaotic than chaotic times. Naturally, severe punishments are boundlessly severe as well. Only after I had determined the core of the law's essence did the series of applications of law incantations come into being. But no matter what, law was still a type of power of order, an elemental power in this world. Not only did law conform to its own characteristics, it also had to conform to the elemental laws. The power of order, the product of extreme order, wasn't just the power of law. Prophecy spells, wishing spells, and other reasonable spells were all used on the level of natural laws. They were quite similar to the power of law, and their characteristics were also the same. The result of casting the spell would either succeed in achieving the desired result, or fail and be completely useless. That was why wishes that were difficult to fulfill would be twisted by those with good intentions or evil intentions. For overly complicated events, prophecy spells that forcefully determine the future would be impossible to fulfill. That was why even if the popes forced prophecies, they would make it sound simple. The power of law was the same. Using law incantations would result in a tug-of-war between friend and foe. If the user of the power of law won, the law incantation would succeed. But if the criminal was too powerful, the offensive spells would be weakened and binding spells would be ineffective. In the end, it would still be a competition of elemental power. The more complicated the application, the weaker the source. The more simple and direct the application, the stronger the source, the more impossible to distort. In the end, when I decided to forge a sword, I finally achieved my goal in the most primitive and foundational way. Begin the trial. Law sword, revenge. An eye for an eye, blood for blood. A life for a life. The moment that the double-edged rune-short sword appeared in midair, Cavendish's physical body directly shattered into pieces under his astonished gaze. I, who was laughing at him, also exploded into pieces. Chapter 8:22. This crimson short sword was decorated with silver runes of light. It had 2 blades, but both blades were so blunt that they couldn't be used to cut anything. In fact, they couldn't even be used as a kitchen knife. On the sword's hilt was the carving of a silver mask figure. This figure held a gavel in one hand, which represented judgment against evil. In the other hand, he held a silver scale, which represented the balance between sin and punishment. A chain hung from his waist was the original codex, which represented the origin of law. Not all of these were God Equipment's actual bodies. However, some of them were objects of dependence. Plus, since this sword was the creator of this short sword was in a way Wumian's incarnation. Judgment, vengeance. Wumian's figure faintly appeared from the sword. When this god of judgment and law appeared in the mortal plane, all sins would be judged. His expressionless silver eyes locked onto all existences before him. There was no trace of emotion in his eyes. What did it feel like to be stared at by himself? However, it definitely didn't feel good to be judged by himself. Guilty. The moment that the gavel landed on the ground, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. My heart and lungs were in great pain, and I was unable to swallow the blood in my throat. Blood was probably already coming out of my mouth. Even if I didn't look, just the pain in my limbs alone was enough for me to know that I was badly injured and that my flesh and blood were flying everywhere. The only reason why I was able to laugh out loud was because Carwin's was even more heavily injured than I was. The tall demon's left hand was already broken. His black magic sword was covered in cracks. It would seem that it was a special weapon that was part of his body. There was nothing below his right knee at all. His entire body was covered in cracks. His flesh and blood were flying everywhere. Any normal person would have died long ago in such a situation. His broken body was barely able to maintain his human form. He was like a broken doll that had been forcefully glued together. If it wasn't for the fact that a chaos main god was powerful enough, this attack would have been more than enough to kill him. However, this was only the beginning. Law, sword, vengeance slowly floated in midair. Wumian's gaze was constantly locked onto the 2 sinners. He was gradually counting our sins. His next judgment would be even more fatal. This was the first of the dual functions of the law, sword's vengeance. When the judge announced that the court was in session, the suspects in the defendant's stand would be gradually counted for their crimes, and then immediately judged and executed. There was no need to doubt that right now, no matter if it was Cavendish or I, our crimes had far surpassed the lower limits of the death penalty. But just as I had expected, the power of law was also a type of dimensional rule. In order for it to be effective, it would naturally have to clash with the target's resistance and abilities. Insta-kill a sovereign with this attack? I didn't even think about it. Being able to injure Cavendish to such an extent was already beyond my expectations. This was a trial on the soul level. If the soul was injured, the physical body would be injured as well. At this moment, his physical body was torn to pieces, and his soul was naturally torn to pieces as well. Ha, Cavendish, it seems like your crimes are much heavier than mine. The basic rule of the power of law was that the heavier the crime, the more effective the power of law would be. From a certain standpoint, I had to thank Wumian's soul judgment when he ascended to God. The original sin of not being punished for any single crime allowed Wumian's to forget about the old grudges from back when I was still Yonya. Otherwise, it would have been difficult to say whose crimes were heavier between me and Cavendish. My current crimes were basically accumulated over the past 10 or so years. A large portion of my crimes were from the massacre, just now. Otherwise, my punishment wouldn't have reached the level of the death penalty. As for Cavendish, even without using the judgment spell, I could see that the sins on his soul were so red that they were almost black. If I died in front of Cavendish, this sword would naturally disappear since it was maintained by my power. That would probably make me the greatest joke of the year. It would be more appropriate to change the name of the undying to the suicidal. This is only the beginning. 1 minute passed, but the execution of the criminals and the death penalty had yet to be completed. The next round of punishment had arrived. Wumian's incarnation's eyes flashed with silver light as he brought down his gavel once again. Guilty. This time, fresh blood seeped out of his mouth once more. What made me delighted was that a large wound had appeared on Carwin's neck where blood and flesh had been splattered everywhere. Fresh blood gushed out like ink. Ha! The duration of each trial is doubled, but the damage is doubled as well. Cavendish, how many times can you last? However, what happened next was beyond my expectations. The heavily injured Cavendish fell silent for once. He suddenly waved his hand, causing numerous soul fragments to float out of the demon's corpse and be absorbed by him. Damn, a demon's soul-devouring ability. Devouring flesh and blood and souls to heal oneself was a common demon ability. Of course, I wouldn't just watch him heal himself like this. But just as I was about to approach him and kill him, I stepped on nothing. My knees were already badly mangled, and I slipped on some blood, causing me to collapse in a pool of my own blood. Cavendish instantly finished absorbing his soul, and his shattered, physical body stabilized. The scene before me caused me to smile as I barely managed to raise my head. Idiot, absorbing souls is also a serious crime. Your next trial will be even more fatal. You die and I live. His short words indicated that he had seen through everything. As long as he killed me before the next trial, this myth-ranked god equipment would naturally lose its effects. No, there's an even simpler method. But right after that, he turned around and left. This actually gave me the biggest headache. An automatic magic sword was obviously unable to move, nor did it have any ability to restrict a person's movement. As long as I walked out of its range and chose a new battlefield, it would be fine. Cavendish, who had experienced countless battles, instantly saw through the weakness of this ability. Of course, I could have added more restrictions to the user's life when I forged this sword, but the power of the natural laws would be greatly weakened. In order to obtain the powerful ability to kill a main god, this magic sword's only special ability was to reflect damage back to the user who inflicted it. Even though Cavendish had seen through this sword's weakness, how could I not be prepared? From the very start, this magic sword wasn't designed to be used by itself. Return, Magic Sword, Northlands. Even though we were indoors, the scenery here instantly changed. Dark clouds filled the sky, and it was snowing heavily. The accumulated snow was increasing at a visible rate. When the snow started falling, even Cavendish paused in surprise for a moment. Perhaps even he hadn't expected that he would experience the Northland's ice and snow again in this place. Meanwhile, I carefully controlled the ice and snow arena and successfully brought the dimensional altar into the battlefield as well. Perhaps the Northland's snow calamity wouldn't be particularly effective against us. But considering the Northland's history, I was quite confident in my ability to destroy buildings. Now that we were trapped in this ice and snow arena, it was possible for the magic sword's second ability to be activated. Now, let's see who can last longer. Chapter 8:23. Amidst the snowy tundra, the two brothers stared at each other as usual. That familiar cold air was unable to cool down their boiling emotions. Sword shadows and sword light seemed to cut apart time itself. For some reason, blood and flesh were flying everywhere as my consciousness sunk into my memories. Imperceptibly, I seemed to have improved even further now that I had all 4 magic swords ready. Previously, when I fought against Sophocles, I had relied on my special ability to counter the main god's power. Perhaps now, in the eyes of the world, I had also reached the level of a main god. Guilty. Wumien's illusory image floated in midair. Every time he struck down with his gavel, not only would snowflakes fall, but both our souls would also shatter into pieces. Perhaps the fact that this magic sword was able to injure Cavendish to such an extent was the best evidence. As time passed, this magic sword was calculating our sins and attacking our souls according to the degree of our sins. At this stage, Cavendish's sins were far heavier than mine, which was why he was injured more severely each time. However, every time I judged him, the mana in my body would be greatly depleted. This mysterious feeling of exhaustion made me want to vomit. After all, I was still the one using this magic sword. Using my own sword to judge myself is basically suicide. But no matter what method we use to fight, we'll still end up like this in the end. I used up a tremendous amount of mana in order to simultaneously maintain the Northland's and Vengeance magic sword special abilities. Even though my mature Arbiter bloodline's mana regeneration abilities were ridiculously high, I was still at a disadvantage in a direct battle. Cavendish's black magic sword suddenly exploded. It was so fast that it was impossible for the naked eye to lock onto it, and it slashed right past my cheek, but it missed by an instant and didn't hit a fatal spot. Try hitting here. I pointed at my weak neck. However, Cavendish didn't respond to my taunt. That's right, it wasn't that he didn't have the heart to do it. It was simply that he didn't dare to. At this moment, I had a wound on my right shoulder that extended all the way to my chest, almost piercing through my heart. Cavendish also had an identical wound on his body, extending from his right shoulder to his chest. The wound stopped at his heart, which was currently burning with pain. Revenge, blood for blood, injury for injury. This was the second effect of Law Sword, Vengeance. The principle behind it was actually the same as the first. It was also to punish the sinner according to the degree of sin they had committed. However, this punishment was instantaneous. When this magic sword was activated within the range of its ability, under the watchful eyes of Judge Wumien's, all harming actions would be directly imprinted onto the body of the perpetrator. If you cut off your opponent's head, your head would also fall off. If you cut off your opponent's arm, your arm would also fall off. This was a demonic sword that could not be won, but it was also a demonic sword that could not be lost. Yes, from the start, I never thought that I could win against Cavendish in close combat. I only hoped that I wouldn't lose. He's so unreasonably strong. Even though I had been mentally prepared, Cavendish's talent in swordsmanship was above mine, his magic talent was above mine, and his battle experience was above mine. I shouldn't be able to defeat him in a hand-to-hand fight. But to actually fight to this extent, it was really infuriating. My speed, strength, and techniques were all suppressed. Every sword attack was instantly seen through and then countered. No matter what kind of trap I set up, my next unrestrained attack would definitely shatter all my battle plans and thoughts. In the end, it would become a chaotic battle that relied on instinct. I would then be at a disadvantage due to my opponent's rich battle experience. Neither of us used any ultimate swordsmanship techniques or major magic spells that required a long chant. That was because at such a distance and in such a chaotic snowstorm battlefield, a seemingly simple attack was actually the best choice for both sword saints. Snowflakes kept falling down as the pitch-black greatsword and the lightsaber kept clashing. Blood and flesh flew everywhere as the snowy ground was dyed red. Everything fell into a cycle. Slash, stab, dodge, counterattack, exchange injury for injury, and then suffer the same pain. The swordsmanship sparring from my childhood was playing out once again. Although both of us were filled with killing intent this time, the results were the same. I was still at a disadvantage. What was even more terrifying was that Carwin's was still growing stronger by the second. That's right, although my injuries were becoming more and more severe, my strength, speed, techniques, and accuracy were all slowly but steadily increasing. The same technique would be ineffective the first time I used it. My originally effective killing technique would be forcefully countered the next time I used it. This seemingly ordinary, but actually cheat-like combat talent was as shameless as ever. My instinctive combat instincts were truly a headache. Most people would hesitate when faced with my abnormal ability to reflect damage. In fact, they would even consider whether or not they would be able to win if this continued. It was even possible for them to directly stop fighting. That would give me enough time to charge up power for my Dawn Holy Sword and deliver a fatal, suicidal attack. However, the moment that Cavendish discovered my damage reflection, he unhesitatingly exchanged injury for injury the moment I started charging up power and stopped me from charging up power. What was even more troublesome was that I could sense that Law Sword, Vengeance's damage against him was already decreasing. He was faintly beginning to resist the power of law. I'm already used to it. Roland, do you have any other aces up your sleeves? Cavendish casually blocked an icicle that suddenly descended from above as he smiled in a way that made me want to beat him up. I knew better than anyone that the power of law wasn't omnipotent. It was only a lower-level concept under the power of order, an existence on the same level as holy light. Law was only a new supernatural power in this world. It was foundationally no different from magic, and could also be resisted and eliminated. However, it was rather depressing to see how quickly Cavendish had gotten used to using this trump card. Who doesn't dare to brag? Fine, I'll just stand here and not move. Do you dare to cut my neck? Even if he was now resistant to the first ability of my Law Sword, Vengeance, the second ability to reflect damage instantly still made this battle an exhausting one. We both knew that it would be impossible to directly kill him. He had been constantly on guard against my swordless left hand. My seal of the four elements was still the trump card that would end this battle. Meanwhile, his sword mostly targeted my ankles, arms, and other limbs. It would seem that eliminating my mobility and combat abilities was his way of winning. Suddenly, Cavendish fell silent as he directly stabbed his sword into the snow. How boring, Roland. It would seem that you never intended to win against me from the very start. No, from the very start, you never thought about the possibility of killing me. I wanted to retort, but when I saw his familiar cold eyes, I didn't say anything in the end. That's right, the power of law had transformed into a double-edged sword of revenge. Although it seemed incredibly powerful, it actually had a restrictive effect. It restricted both sides from killing each other or engaging in melee combat, and delayed the time it took for a victor to be decided. However, this didn't increase my chances of winning at all. Those who truly desired victory would invest their resources into increasing their advantage in an attempt to suppress their opponent. As for me, from the very start, I had been thinking about how not to lose and how to die together with my opponent. There was nothing wrong with this strategy. Under normal circumstances, Cavendish's power level should be higher than mine, so there was nothing wrong with thinking about how not to lose first. Plus, due to the special connection between our souls, it was completely reasonable for me to think about how not to lose. Was Cavendish dissatisfied with my current situation? Did he think that I was being perfunctory? I'm seriously trying to kill you, yet you're being perfunctory. What's the meaning of this? Perhaps that was exactly what he meant. Suddenly, Cavendish chuckled evilly. It would seem that I still need to give you some motivation. Roland, do you really think that since there are two doors, there won't be a third door? Do you really think that killing my demon fetus and mother's body will be enough to stop me? Have you forgotten about the mortal plane and the bloodline that both you and I know about? What? At this moment, I thought about many things. But then, Cavendish laughed loudly as he swung his sword. His magic sword gave off a dangerous aura, preventing me from saying anything else. Even though I comforted myself by telling myself that my allies in the mortal plane, the Hades, and the Holy Light faction wouldn't just watch as this situation worsened, and even though I had already prepared a backup plan for my bloodline, I was still shaken by my many emotions. The next second, I also made up my mind. I had accumulated enough ice and snow, and this was my trump card for victory. I absolutely had to end this battle as soon as possible. I took a deep breath and stabbed my ice and snow magic sword into the snowy ground, causing the snowy plains to begin boiling. Let's begin. Zero's March. Chapter 824. Perhaps using my magic sword from the Northlands was a mistake from the very start. At the very least, when I chose Cavendish as my opponent, I couldn't hope to see how effective this sword of ice and snow would be. It was unimaginable that Northlanders wouldn't be able to adapt to the snow, and professional warriors would have to fight in snowy mountains since they were young. Only newcomers from other lands would be allowed to use the excuse of being hindered by the weather as an excuse. Even though it had been many years since I returned to the Northlands to fight in the snow, I couldn't hope that Cavendish would have forgotten all about fighting in the snow and how to avoid snow disasters. After all, the deepest memories of knowledge and skills were usually from childhood. What one learned from a young age was no longer just knowledge and skills. It was also the foundational knowledge that formed a person's personality and way of thinking. Fishermen by the seaside feared the unknown ocean. Old sailors and ship captains were more or less superstitious when faced with the endless sea that was constantly changing. In the eyes of H.E.'s inland residents, Northlanders were taciturn, reckless, and disobedient. They were as sturdy as the glaciers on the tundra, and lacked even more civilization than the barbarians. Although this was a type of prejudice, in a way it was a choice for survival. As a Northlander, one would only encounter bad weather after bad weather, and the lack of resources would bring about all sorts of hardships. The incomprehensible tenacity of one's personality would become a necessary requirement for living in the Northlands. One couldn't count on the heavens to be kind, because there would always be more bad weather than good weather. One couldn't rely on luck. The fatal natural conditions would cause everything to rapidly worsen. Little beasts and saplings that were exposed to the elements wouldn't be able to survive more than a single day. Only by constantly thinking and making all preparations would one be able to have a great harvest. A single accident, a sudden snow disaster, would completely ruin one's plan. A year's worth of hard work would go to waste. Hurry up and get up. Winter was coming. If one didn't prepare enough food for the winter, they would freeze to death. The cruel Northlands wouldn't give one the time to sigh and be depressed. Was it very negative to think about the worst of everything? When most situations were worsening beyond expectations, this type of negative thinking was a normal way of thinking. Toughness, or the strength to live on regardless of how bad the situation was, might seem pessimistic and rigid in the eyes of outsiders, but it was necessary. Actually, it's all the same. Even if you leave the Northlands, isn't this damned world still cruel and realistic? If you want to live well, no amount of preparation or backup plans will be too much. Only by carefully planning and scheming will you be able to survive. Well, the world is just as unpredictable as the blizzard in the Northlands. Misfortune can descend at any moment, so I should just enjoy myself. At the very least, when I die, I'll be able to loudly announce to the world that I, Cavendish, have lived a more carefree and happy life than all of you, and I've had a lot of fun in my life. The same material, the same environment, and the same location had eventually evolved into two completely different modes of thinking and personalities. Was this a trick of fate? Or was it the choice of the two goddesses? Or was it just a pure coincidence? Roland, your ice and snow are useless against me. Stop, or you will be exhausted to death by this meaningless consumption. Cavendish's words weren't a lie. He was enjoying this battle and didn't want to obtain an easy victory because of this reason. No matter how effective an Earth-type ability was, its consumption would always be the greatest. Rather than opening the door to the dimensional barrier, Roland was probably more interested in a delightful battle. The crueler the better. This single-celled organism, bastard single-celled organism, others will do anything for the sake of their goal. But you're forgetting your goal for the sake of the means. Others? Are you referring to yourself? Isn't your goal obvious now? Only by killing me will you be able to stop the door to the dimensional barrier, so why are you still hesitating? Bring out all your trump cards. Let me have a good time. I confirmed once again that it wasn't that Cavendish didn't have a brain, but rather that he didn't want to use his brain. His natural desire for excitement and pleasure was placed in front of rationality. His rare and excellent logical thinking was all for the sake of that damned idea of how to have a good time fighting. What's the difference between a human's rationality and an animal's? Amidst the snowstorm that obscured my vision, the snow mountain was collapsing. Amidst the waves of snow, sound waves became the only weapon I could use in combat. You're thinking so much about everything and living in a box. What's the difference between you and a puppet? While stalling for time, my useless verbal cannons were also effective. The effects of my magic sword Northlands were now so bad that I couldn't even look at it directly. The blood-curdling screams came a little later than the pain in his body. While the effects of each trial were doubled, the time between each trial would also be doubled. The next trial should be in 16 minutes. I couldn't wait any longer. I could cast holy light on myself and use my life force, while Roland could use soul devouring to recover from his injuries. This amount of time would be more than enough for us to fully recover our physical bodies. Only using magic swords to determine victory would require us to accumulate enough trials to instantly kill us. That would still take a long time. Judging from the current battle situation, Roland had relied on his intuition rather than his thinking to adapt to the ice and snow elves, as well as his health and the new curriculum changes. Much better than me. He easily dodged the hailstones and dug holes to avoid the avalanches. His reactions were quite swift. If this continued, it would be a huge loss for him to use a large amount of mana to maintain this world of ice and snow. Not far away, the altar was now covered in ice and snow. It was unknown whether it was the hailstones or the avalanches, but the goddess statue on the right side of the altar had already been destroyed. The lower half of the altar was now completely buried in the snow. At the very least, it would be impossible to use the altar before it was repaired. But I hadn't worked so hard to maintain this place just to destroy this altar. Otherwise, I would have many more convenient methods to do so. Even though I clearly noticed that my magic sword Northlands was quite ineffective against Cavendish, I still persisted in maintaining it. This wasn't just to limit his movement radius. I had already achieved my first goal. In that case, let me try out this new trump card that I had just finished developing. This time, I would truly be using the power of a creator goddess. Cavendish, didn't you want to see my abilities? This attack would probably be more than enough to crush any main god. Rise, Zero's army. As I called out in a low voice, the entire frozen land began to tremble. Countless white figures climbed out of the snow. Their bodies were made of ice and snow, but most of them were in the form of ice crystal skeletons. These existences were clearly the crystallization of ice and snow. However, they didn't have any of the sluggishness and coldness that elemental creatures had. They seemed as if they had just been born and were confused as they crawled on the ground on all fours, just like newborn babies. But soon their appearances began to change. Skin of ice and snow began to grow on their skeletons, and their limbs began to evolve into normal standing limbs. It was as if they had completed the evolution from infants to adults or monkeys to humans in a short period of time. First, the physical body. In H's world, ice and snow were probably the farthest thing from life. But in the Hades plane, ice and snow were the foundation of all undead physical bodies. In H's world, ice and snow were equivalent to life. In my eyes, the Northlands wasn't a forbidden zone for life at all. And now that this magic sword was unsheathed, it meant that my personal domain of life had been opened. The ice and snow that my magic sword had spread throughout the Northlands had transformed into seeds of life. Numerous ice and snow life forms were being born within the seeds. But in order to accomplish this, I had to thank an undead emperor who selflessly gave me all of her research information. Conservation. Back in the day, in my personal bug-like world, Conservation, who possessed limitless mana, had shown me something inconceivable: magical bone transformation. Undead emperors who didn't have undead creations would be greatly weakened in power. Corpses would forever be a necessary combat resource for undead mages, until conservation's research results appeared out of nowhere. She used her mana to create bones that should have originally belonged to life. Then, she treated these materials as ordinary bones and used undead magic to control them, creating undead cannon fodder and bone giants. For conservation, perhaps this was only a simple trick to save on spellcasting materials and how to collect them. Only she, who had limitless mana, would be able to extravagantly use her mana to create artificial bones. But for me, this was a path to the heavens. The existence of Hades gave ice and snow elements the ability to transform into living elements under certain conditions. This was the theory behind it. Artificial bone transformation was a technique that used mana to create bones unique to living creatures. This was the process of transforming mana into living creatures. After I obtained the theory and technique, all I needed to do was to use my two major tools, ice magic and undead magic, to experiment and refine the technique over and over again. Only then would I be able to create a mature technique. The scene before me seemed like the lowest level of elemental creatures, but this was actually a special ability of the creator goddesses, the creation of life. And this was only the beginning. This technique was originally only theoretical research. It would be meaningless to create a bunch of babies on the battlefield. However, due to an unexpected accident, a kind-hearted person gave me a gift of friendship that made up for what I lacked the most in my technical chain. This instantly made my dragon-slaying techniques abnormally useful, no, abnormally scary. Yes, it was likely that some people had already guessed that the kind-hearted person I mentioned was none other than the Sky Tower Spirit. His artificial souls and knowledge transfer technique, along with my own soul-splitting technique, finally created an actual creator goddess-level forbidden spell, Roland's 8th sin. Army-level forbidden spells, city-level forbidden spells, country-level forbidden spells, race-level forbidden spells, and god-level forbidden spells. Forbidden spells had simple divisions based on their destructive power and range. If I had to give this forbidden spell a rank, perhaps only a world-level forbidden spell would be more suitable. Originally, this forbidden spell's intended enemy was multiple main gods and endless chaos abyss armies. Cavendish, it was only natural that you would die to this forbidden spell. Forbidden spell, Roland's 8th sin. The first part, Zero's March, has ended. The second part, the forbidden fruit of artificial souls, activate. Chapter 8:25. The Halettim generation could be said to be the standard of civilization in the world of Aichi. If it wasn't for the fact that they had gone too far into the forbidden domain and were destroyed by the gods of the time, the elves, beastmen, and future humans wouldn't have been able to survive. The Halettim generation was the three greatest creations of the Halettim generation that they were proud of. They were also the foundational reason for their destruction. The most foundational and core of these three creations was the artificial soul. Creating a soul from scratch wasn't only a creator goddess level of power, it even surpassed the limits of the order and chaos goddesses. Perhaps only Aichi had such a power. The second part of the forbidden spell, the forbidden fruit of creating artificial souls. A pitch-black short sword traversed the distance of space and time as it responded to its master's summons. The moment that this short sword that had absorbed countless souls appeared here, the surrounding snow was instantly tainted black by the undead. 7 sins of the demonic sword. It had just harvested countless lives on the battlefield. Right now, its existence here was like the gates of hell had been opened, and countless souls were pouring out. Seeking for endless knowledge and truth and mastering the god's secrets is a taboo even for intelligent creatures to play with fire, even though it's an instinctive desire for knowledge. When humans finally believe that they've surpassed the limits of the creator goddesses, they will naturally try to obtain the creator goddess authority. And in Aichi, this is the equivalent of suicide. My understanding of human nature had long since become a philosophical one. Everyone had their own way of thinking, and there was no right or wrong to begin with. I had always believed that the 7 sins, which were originally viewed as the source of all human evil, were also, in a way, the driving force behind the progress of all living creatures and even society. This 8th sin was the same. Since it involved the source of the soul, the Halettim generation was in danger of the river Styx's cycle of reincarnation. However, the Halettim generation's research results were left behind in this world. Spell model complete. Artificial soul template complete. Although the Halettim generation's technology was amazing and could create artificial souls from living creatures, I had to say that while they were quite good in terms of theory and technology, they were incredibly weak in terms of application. Creating an artificial soul with a certain amount of knowledge and self-awareness just to be used as a labor and computing machine was an incredibly foolish waste of resources. As for me, I immediately discovered the frightening combat potential of transforming magic into living beings and creating artificial souls when I got my hands on these 2 major technologies. Isn't this a magical version of a clone army? From a certain point of view, when magic and science reach the extreme, they would actually involve the essence of life and the soul. It could be said that they reach the same goal through different means. Because of the overwhelming advantage of the magic civilization in soul studies, such replicas were essentially more similar to the originals. All power originates from the soul. If souls can be customized, can powerhouses be mass-produced? Lack of combat experience and killing techniques? Couldn't she just use necromancy to copy memories? And Harloise was an expert among experts in this field. Her soul book was not only capable of copying memories, it was also capable of copying one's personality and sense of self. Artificial souls have a limited capacity. In that case, the soul-splitting technology used to create the 7 deadly sins would be useful. Cutting the soul fragments of a powerful mother and using them to create the soul seed of a duplicate was a mature technology used to create super undead creatures. In order to maintain the liveliness and completeness of the souls, I even used the method of splitting and duplicating the soul book that I obtained from Harloise. Every single soul was a page of that book. Lack of a corresponding physical body? This was the creator goddess's ability to control the miracle of life. Conservation and I had combined everything together to create a temporary life out of ice and snow. This would break through all limits. Insufficient mana? The super classic version of Olivia's magic box was a super rare item that could supply the defense of an entire city's mage tower. That was 50 mana pools worth of mana. Although it was possible in theory, there were too many accidents that could happen. Too much technology was lacking, and the success rate would be too low. Indeed, it would be nearly impossible to turn these scattered pieces of technology into gears that worked together to propel the usage of the entire forbidden spell. However, in this world, there were special weapons that could turn the impossible probability of success into something that was certain. Soul World, Northland stabilized. Creation of Roland, physical body has been completed, beginning to inject artificial souls. Even in this soul world of ice and snow, each of these artificial souls only had about 60% to 70% of my strength. Every single soul was an artificial soul created out of my soul shards and living soul materials. Perhaps their intelligence wasn't perfect and they had almost no emotions, but their killing techniques and combat experience were at least 60% to 70% of my own. Numerous skeletons of ice and snow completed their evolution in front of me. These skeletons were covered in flesh and blood, as well as armor made of ice and snow. They even picked up swords made of ice and snow. However, their familiar faces and lifeless eyes made me shiver from the bottom of my heart. 1 Roland, 2 Rolands, 3 Rolands. Fine then, countless Rolands. Harloise, Roland, and Conservation were 3 top-level existences in the field of soul science. They combined their research results with the most precious technological treasures from the Halettim generation to create this unstoppable miracle. Cavendish, if you can last for 5 minutes against this army of 1342 Rolands, then even if I'll still win. So what if you can last for 5 minutes? You'll still die after 10 minutes. Cavendish didn't even bother to respond to me. The endless army of powerful individuals before him caused him to laugh maniacally while trembling. He had pointlessly started a 1 versus 1 battle. I heaved a sigh of relief at Cavendish's insanity. The result of cutting my soul too much was that my vision was now hazy, and my head was aching so much that I couldn't feel anything. Not only was my mana source being destroyed, but my life force was also being destroyed. This combination forbidden spell had far surpassed the limits of any individual mage. While I obtained unstoppable combat strength, my physical body and soul were also beginning to collapse. That's right. What I had just said to Cavendish was a lie. I had never lied in my entire life precisely so that I could lie to him at a time like this. As expected, Cavendish had fallen for my trap. If he tried to stall for time and run away, I would definitely be the one who couldn't take it anymore. And since I said that, he definitely wouldn't run away. How long could I last? The next second? The next minute? The next judgment? How long could he last? No matter what trump card he had, I felt that it wouldn't be any better than this. Would he die first, or would I kill myself first? This was truly interesting. Chapter 8:26. What was slaughter? It was probably an operation with the goal of ending the opponent's life. The ones in front of me are probably the purest killing machines in the world. He had a kind smile on his good-looking face, but there wasn't the slightest hint of a smile in his eyes. He clearly didn't have any killing intent, but he was still killing. Seriously, who did he learn this kind of pervert who kills while smiling? Can't you guys be a little more self-aware? Whose clones are they? Who's the one who laughs the more dangerous the situation is? Cavendish. Keep pretending. Perhaps he knew that he didn't have many chances left, so he chatted casually with the goddess, who foolishly messed everything up. It was surprisingly a precious moment. Battlefield. It was very smooth, so smooth that there was no need to pay too much attention to it. The current Cavendish was like a giant beast that was being hunted. Even though he was still arrogant, angry, and had a threatening aura, his body was now covered in ice spears and swords. Just the amount of blood he lost would be enough for him to die. This group of smiling Roland didn't have any pity or anger. In fact, they didn't even have any hostility. However, every attack they made was extremely dangerous. Turning into a dragon, using the profound killing move, exchanging wound for wound. Even if he had to pay with his life, it would be worth it as long as there was a scar that could not heal. Even as the creator, I couldn't imagine how dangerous it would be when I risked my life. The desperate Cavendish was incredibly strong, to the point of despair. I discovered to my astonishment that Cavendish's individual power level was even slightly above Sophocles'. However, in front of 1,342 Rolands, even if Rolands only had less than half of their strength, Cavendish's strength was still meaningless. Just like the sword saints of the samurai era, when faced with a torrent of steel beasts, what they encountered was not an opponent that they could face head-on, but a crushing difference in power level. What was even more unfair to Cavendish was that once he attacked Roland, the reflected damage would be fatal, while Roland would die without hesitation. When the difference in individual strength wasn't pulled apart, when Cavendish's hands and feet were tied up, the side with more people naturally won. Ow! Roland! You dare! I don't dare! I could even guess what this single-celled creature was shouting at me. It would be nothing more than some nonsense, like fight me head-on. Would verbal taunts even mean anything to me? Not only that, right now, I probably only had the strength to watch. Perhaps even watch would be difficult for me. My vision was now hazy. I could only sense of my life to understand what was happening. It was as if my physical body and soul were collapsing. My sense of hearing had lost as well. Roland, Roland. It seemed like Carwins had gone berserk. His aura suddenly rose by quite a bit. The entire world had been set ablaze, and the domain of chaos was attempting to destroy space itself. As long as I could escape from this place, I wouldn't have the strength to set up another one. Roland of Roland of Roland was to have Roland of me. Roland, Roland roof of. Although I could no longer see clearly, I could sense that Carwins was gradually weakening, weakening and weakening. His life force was like a flickering flame that could be extinguished at any moment. Ha, how pitiful. The foolish goddess sent me a scene. My arrogant younger brother was currently being pierced by a forest of ice spears. The Roland of. Roland was finishing their final harvest. Roland's screams echoed in my ears. The demon god's blood kept dripping onto the snow. The demon prince's soul fire was on the verge of being extinguished. Why do I have to risk my life every time? My past memories flashed in my mind like a movie. How many times had I experienced these flashbacks already? Couldn't my opponent be slightly weaker? My physical body had already lost its consciousness. Cavendish's screams continued. If this continued, I would probably die before him. Fortunately, I could sense that Wumian's shadow appeared above my head. When Wumian's gavel landed, the final trial had arrived. It's finally over! When silver flashes filled my vision, I smiled. This time, I smiled in satisfaction from the bottom of my heart. Then, all I saw was a familiar, pitch-black darkness. This time I can have a good sleep. Sleep? It's over? What kind of sweet dream are you having? A familiar, angry roar echoed in my ears. Could it be that Cavendish had already broken out of my prison? I suddenly woke up, only to discover that I was no longer in the deepest part of the chaos abyss. I was in a boundless river. Countless souls were floating in that familiar, grayish-black river water. The furious Roland in front of me seemed rather familiar. Cavendish? I was quite astonished, because the soul in front of me was also quite weak. I finally understood the current situation. It would seem that no matter who died first, we were all dead now. In that case, everything would be over. I smiled. At the very least, it was possible for me to reincarnate. This was far better than the worst-case scenario that I had expected. Over. Don't even think about it. Just lie here and suck on your fingers as you watch me open the door to the chaos abyss. Cavendish's words sounded rather ridiculous. What else could he possibly do in such a state? But the next instant I understood. His soul eyes had lost all emotion. He was no different from the undead around him who had no sense of self. Where could his consciousness go in such a situation? His consciousness has been transferred. He even has a bloodline descendant. I recalled Cavendish's previous threat. A bloodline descendant that we all know about. Damn it. Renee? Chapter 827. The demon bloodline had always been a double-edged sword. In the mortal plane, there was no job class that could grow faster than demon warlocks. They only needed to relax their control over their bloodline and borrow power from their demon ancestors, or chaos lords to rapidly grow as if they were the main character's main character aura. 1 year at gold rank, 2 years at legend rank, and 10 years at saint rank. Other job classes didn't even need to think about it. But if a demon warlock could truly improve like this, he would no longer be himself. Demons weren't kind-hearted people who loved to help others. It was the opposite. Their loan service of getting on the train first, then paying for the ticket, was far more evil than even the most black-hearted loan sharks. There's no such thing as a free lunch in this world. If you think there's an exception, that's because you've already unknowingly paid everything. This was probably the most appropriate way to describe the relationship between demons and mortals. But from a certain standpoint, it was also correct to describe the relationship between mortals and gods. As long as you proved the value of your investment, the demons and gods would generously give you their power. It was just like how loan companies would always greet you with smiles at the beginning, as if they had an excess of money or power and would seize every opportunity to give it away. The gods and gods were even worse than loan companies in that they didn't want your money. They wanted everything you had. No matter if it was the upper planes or the chaos abyss, the most valuable currency would always be an ordinary person's soul. 4 high-level gods and gods. Their divine power and magic power were part of themselves. Whenever you tried to obtain that power, it would be the equivalent of opening the door to your own soul and inviting an outsider into your own home. If you really casually used this power, you would be connected to the existence of the gods and gods. You might think that you were controlling this power, but you would actually be corroded by this power and become a part of it. Puppets, god envoys, fanatics, evil cultists, gods chosen, demon awakened, and so on, depending on which god or god was interested in, would be the final outcome. There was actually no foundational difference between these identities. Cavendish had his eyes on Renée from the very start. No, perhaps it should be said that Renée's birth had been prepared for Cavendish. Their identical soul imprints explained everything. Soul imprints were the crystallization of a person's natural talent and past path. There was no precedent of 2 people possessing identical soul imprints without the guidance of an outsider. And with Renée's natural talent and power level, awakening such a cheat-like super soul imprint, as long as she believed herself to be strong, she would be strong, seemed like a joke no matter what. A mortal body created by Cavendish through his bloodline to walk on the surface. This was my inference about Renée. Back when powerful demons and gods were unable to do as they pleased on the surface, it was quite common for them to use their own descendants as gods' descenders or physical bodies to descend onto the mortal plane. Sometimes such a physical body would have other uses as well. For example, when a god or powerful demon was destined to die, the body could be used as a seed for their revival. For instance, a certain evil god had once left behind several hundred descendants of goblins, dragons, giants, insects, centaurs, deer, and so on. He had these descendants fight against each other and kill off the weak while keeping the strong. The final victor became the evil god's vessel for his revival. Not only did his power level not decrease, it actually increased. I couldn't help but sigh at how varied his tastes were. Ahem, I meant that he was quite thoughtful. Casting a net of light was a common choice for reviving seeds. Breeding records and reproductive barriers were repeatedly broken by these shameless superior existences. However, it was evident that Cavendish greatly valued Renée's body. He definitely wouldn't casually scatter a seed. Their physical appearances were exactly the same. Perhaps outsiders would only see this as a coincidence, but my inference was that she was so similar to him that their DNA and cells were the same. In order to perform a perfect demon descent, not only did Cavendish duplicate his own physical body, he even spent a great deal of effort to modify Renée's soul. That was the only reason why she had an identical soul imprint. At our level, soul imprints would no longer be of critical importance on the battlefield. However, soul imprints were the starting point for all legends, the source of future development, the cornerstone of a skyscraper, and the platform for building the future. For an ordinary god's descent, it would be enough to find a random physical body. Although the higher the compatibility, the better, it would be impossible to have the exact same soul imprint. That would be almost impossible. For Cavendish, Renée could be said to be a duplicate of himself. Of course, when considering the fact that Cavendish had definitely contributed greatly to her birth, it wouldn't be wrong to say that she was his biological daughter. For Cavendish, Renée was incredibly important, to the point where it was abnormal. But for the Mist Kingdom, Renée was also incredibly important. I couldn't just kill her just because there was a possibility that I might become Cavendish's enemy, ending everything once and for all. All right then, I admit that I probably wouldn't be able to do such a thing. There was always a way out. It wasn't certain that a demon or god's descendant would forever be controlled by their superior existences. Many powerful demons and true gods were gods or demons' descendants. As long as they worked hard to perfect themselves and escape the temptation of their superior existence's power, obtaining a true name and becoming truly independent was possible. I didn't know much about the gods, but in the chaos abyss, where the strong preyed on the weak, it seemed that defeating the strong was a highly praised virtue. I tried to teach Renee to find her own path and not rely on the power of chaos in her bloodline. This seemingly free lunch was actually ridiculously expensive. Cavendish had possessed Renee multiple times. Although he had done many ridiculous things, he was a perfect personal grandfather who helped Renee overcome all obstacles and even saved the Mist Kingdom in Renee's place. It was likely that it would be quite difficult to erase the favorable impression that he had saved the Mist Kingdom. Perhaps the thing that made Renee lower her guard the most was my relationship with Cavendish. Perhaps in her mind, Roland's younger brother Cavendish wasn't some evil villain that needed to be strictly guarded against, especially since he had possessed her body to save the Mist Kingdom. Not only that, he was also quite humorous and intelligent. Rain's kindness towards Carwins would be quite fatal. While Rain was busy with government affairs and many other national affairs, she had to make time to train hard in order to ensure that her power level didn't decrease, and she also had to rely on her bloodline's power to swiftly grow stronger. I found it impossible to imagine that Rain would be able to completely resist the temptation of her bloodline, especially when her personal talent was so terrible. Her previous foundational power had all been built up by the power of the chaos. At least 50% of the Night Princess's legend came from her personal grandfather. It could be said that without Cavendish, there would be no Night Princess Renee. Reliance was a habit. Trust was buried deep within one's heart. It was almost instinctual. It was fine for me to use it before. Why would it be fine for me to use it again? Once such an attitude was formed, it would be quite difficult for outsiders to convince her no matter how they tried to explain it to her, especially when she was still filled with trust towards Cavendish. In the end, I half forcefully changed Renee's bloodline. The one who suffered along with her was Galena, who didn't need to do this to begin with. After all, she had been fighting against the chaos abyss since she was young. Her willpower to defend herself to the death was quite reassuring. Her hard work and outstanding talent allowed her to grow at a tremendous pace. Stealing the power of her bloodline to improve herself was also a shortcut. Changing my bloodline didn't mean that it was the end. At the very least, it would cut off my connection with Cavendish. My bloodline was more than enough to install an iron door between Cavendish and Renee. But if the owner of the room couldn't resist the temptation and open the door herself, then no matter how sturdy the iron door was, it would become meaningless. As a Chaos Knight, Renee was a powerful job class member who used the power of chaos, similar to a demon warlock. Unless she gave up everything and started all over again, it would be inevitable for her to have a relationship with the chaos abyss. I didn't know whether or not Renee had asked Cavendish to borrow her power, how much she had borrowed, and whether or not she had accidentally sold herself out. But just looking at Renee's rapid growth rate made me feel that the situation was far from good. That was why I made some additional preparations. When Renee woke up from her fatigued sleep, before she could completely adapt to the changes in her physical body, someone blocked her path. This person had a familiar face and an even stranger, yet familiar dual voice. Huh, isn't this my foolish younger brother / younger sister? Little brat / little girl, are you lost? Chapter 828. Barty's battle seemed to have reached its end as the Chaos main gods collapsed one by one. However, the core of the battle was still the god who was enveloped in endless holy light. However, he now appeared rather unsightly. The holy light that was so blinding that people couldn't even look at it had dimmed. When he used divine power to counteract the Chaos main god's self-destructions, he naturally used up even more power. Time and time again, main god-level clones perished, taking with them the power of faith and divine power that had been accumulated over thousands of years. Finally, the face hidden in the light appeared before the mortals. He had blonde hair, blue eyes, a rather handsome face, and a cold, expressionless face. Perhaps he would be quite popular among women. But at this time, this was a sign of weakness. Finally, the God of Holy Light is no longer undefeatable. There was an old saying that the enemy of an enemy was a friend. It was quite easy for friendship to come when there was a common enemy. But if the common enemy disappeared, friendship would easily capsize. The nature gods and other neutral gods all wanted to become even stronger and become the ruler of this vast mortal plane. Not to mention the chaos main gods who were eager to take action. Many ancient existences among them had been paying attention to this battle all this time. The will of the chaos abyss would be unable to order a main god around. Carwin's relationship with a main god was more like a mercenary relationship. Apart from the unfortunate Donati's, Sophocles, and the inexperienced Carwins wouldn't be able to order any of the chaos abyss main gods, whose names had long since been forgotten by ordinary people. Most of these ancients were defeated in the past holy wars. Some were once great heroes, and some were survivors of the ruling god systems. Perhaps some among them were living a peaceful life of retirement, and some were tired of the holy wars. However, there were definitely some who still had ambitions for the mortal plane and were restlessly hiding in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity. In the previous holy wars, these ancient existences hadn't taken action because of the existence of the will of the chaos abyss. This was because they wouldn't be able to become the final victors without their own kin. But now, the will of the chaos abyss was no longer present, so all restrictions were meaningless. It seemed that it was time for them to return to the mortal plane. However, the God of Holy Light was far too much of an eyesore. The God of Holy Light was the strongest main god. He was an existence that was impossible to defeat. No main god would be able to fight against him. His pure divine power server had finally reached the limits of the multiverse. The undefeatable God of Holy Light was more than enough to threaten any powerful existence with ambitions for the mortal plane. The Chaos faction's overall power level was several times stronger than the Order faction. This was a fact that everyone knew. If a sufficient number of Chaos main gods joined forces to invade the Order faction, even the God of Holy Light would definitely be defeated. Of course, the invading main gods would probably die at the God of Holy Light's hands. Nobody was willing to become cannon fodder. The end result was that nobody started invading the undead plane. This was all because of the existence of the God of Holy Light. Even I had to admit this. I had tried to weaken the God of Holy Light in order to create an opportunity for hell. However, I had always controlled the degree of weakening the God of Holy Light. I had stepped on the brakes at several important decisions. I knew that it was absolutely necessary for the God of Holy Light to exist in the mortal plane before the Hell faction and Nature faction truly took over the Holy Light faction's territory. But now, everything had changed as Cavendish's final plan took effect. Perhaps the God of Holy Light hadn't been weakened by much. Perhaps he was still the strongest main god in the world. However, he had now revealed his weakness in front of everyone. He was no longer undefeatable. The wolves that had feared him would now view him as weak prey. They wouldn't give him any time to rest or recover. Meanwhile, behind the God of Holy Light, his allies from earlier were also having their own thoughts. Perhaps now that the external enemy had been eliminated, it was time to settle old scores. In a way, the Chaos faction was much more proactive than the Order faction. Perhaps it would be difficult for them to form a stable alliance, but they would unhesitatingly use all their chips when an opportunity presented itself. 1, 2, 5. I don't usually see them, but they've all appeared now. Renee was counting the number of Chaos main gods that were currently on the battlefield or about to enter the battlefield. This wasn't the end of the battle. Chaos domains opened up one after another. The chaos dimensional door that had originally been closed was forcefully opened from the other side. The chaos main gods all turned their gazes here. This time their target wasn't Carwyn's. Instead, it was the large ball of light that was showing signs of weakening. The scariest enemy would always be the unknown. Now that the god of holy light finally lost his barrier of the unknown and revealed his trump card, he instantly went from being the hunter to the hunted. This had been Renee's choice from the very start. In the captain's room of the Borealis airship, the flagship of the Mist Kingdom's Big Dipper fleet, Renee had just woken up from a deep sleep when she encountered the legendary Borealis airship. "My dear younger brother, where do you intend to go?" Cavendish didn't respond. Instead, he chuckled out loud as he looked at Rain's icy and angry face. "Haha, Roland, I never expected that you would have such a hobby of cross-dressing and acting as a child." There was an explosion as the little Loli's thick and black tube shot out a fatal object. Cavendish could only swallow the rest of his mocking words. Galena Mist was Roland Mist's proudest and most outstanding disciple. Roland had once used his own bloodline to replace Galena Mist's bloodline. It could be said that Galena Mist's bloodline was an inferior version of the Arbiter bloodline. Her power level had reached semi-god several years ago. She scored full points in all sorts of subjects. Her combat techniques and experience were excellent as well. Her knowledge in all sorts of engineering was an excellent support. She was at the top of the world in everything from her combat puppets to her explosives. Renee Mist had a chaos bloodline. She was a chaos knight who mainly fought by summoning demons. Plus, she had a lazy attitude towards cultivation. It was a compliment to say that her power level was a mystery. Her actual power level was mediocre. If Roland, who had a god's descent, and Cavendish, who had an ancestral bloodline, were about the same in power level, then in a one-on-one fight, Galena would be able to take care of 10 Renees. And when the pilot's techniques were about the same, the performance of the pilot's body would become the key to victory. Perhaps Renee was far more of an outstanding warrior than Galena. However, the young Galena had fought so hard all along. She had long since stood at the top of the world. The worst part was that Renee was a user of the power of the Chaos Abyss. She was someone who borrowed power, and when the person she borrowed power from, my ancestor Cavendish, died, it would be quite difficult to say how much power she had left. At the very least, if a true god died, that true god's priest would be completely useless. On the other hand, Renee was definitely resisting Cavendish's will. Meanwhile, Galena was cooperating with Roland. With 1 plus and 1 minus, the difference between the two sides became even greater. You have no chance of winning. Voluntarily leave Renee's body, and I'll only seal you for 500 years. Otherwise, this wasn't an empty threat. There was an obvious difference in power between their bodies. The feeling of weakness within his body made Cavendish realize that it was impossible for him to win. At the same time, he was also regretting that he shouldn't have urged his descendant to properly cultivate instead of resting. Renee was relying too much on the power of the Chaos Abyss. Is this the end? Cavendish was rather hesitant. He felt that it was a pity, but more than anything, he was displeased that the game had ended so early. Saying that there would be a third door was obviously just a lie to sway Roland. At this point, it seemed that everything could only end here. Perhaps admitting defeat would at least look better on the surface. If the result was already decided, it would be rather unseemly to be beaten to death before being sealed. Asterisk crack. Asterisk at this moment, the entire world trembled slightly. It was as if something had silently changed. It was as if a certain door had been opened by a key. The two siblings exchanged glances in a small room. Both of them paused in surprise. This scene had completely exceeded their expectations. Just what had happened. The door opened. After a while, Roland and Cavendish both realized what had happened. I should have hardened my heart and killed her, even if she was Harlow's father, Dedina. Ha! Don't say that after the fact. You wouldn't have been able to do it. Without a neutral jury, you wouldn't have been able to activate that law sword at all. How could you possibly have won against me without that? Indeed, this was the only possible explanation. At this moment, in the Chaos Abyss, the former Elven Emperor Dedina, the former Chaos Girl, opened that door as the only survivor here. Chapter 829. Let's rewind time slightly. About an hour before the dimensional door was opened, the battle between the two brothers in the Chaos Abyss came to an end. Death sentence. When the judge smashed down his gavel for the final time, everything was reduced to dust, just like an afterimage that was shattered. The two brothers fell at the same time, and the Roland clones also turned into bubbles at the same time. The endless snow swiftly melted, and the pitch-black palace returned to the world. The snow took away all the corpses and ruins, leaving behind only an empty hall. Wretch, the only survivor in this hall, was currently lying on the ground and vomiting. This wasn't some evil curse, nor was he a novice who couldn't stand the sight of blood. It was simply that he suddenly relaxed after experiencing intense fear. His body's natural instincts of being able to survive were rather unbearable. When a snake stared at a frog, its instinctive fear would make it impossible for the frog to move. The cruelest death sentence would be to tell the frog when it would die, causing the frog to slowly die in fear and anxiety. The difference between Cavendish, Roland, and Dedina was no longer the difference between a snake and a frog. This was the difference between a T-Rex and an ant. Just the wind and tremors caused by Dedina's movement would be enough to destroy an ant colony. The survivors were tied up in the audience seats and forcibly enjoyed this monster battle at the closest possible distance for more than an hour. Even though the slightest shockwave would shatter their bodies, they didn't die because they were jurors. Even though they should have been completely dead, they managed to survive without any injuries due to the court's requirements. Perhaps killing intent was only a legend in novels. However, high-level demons were indeed capable of killing mortals and low-level magical creatures with their auras and angry glares. The battle between the two main gods finally escalated into a chaotic battle between over 1,000 main gods and powerful gods. Dedina had been willing to die many times over. However, the result of this dance with the death god was that the succubus mind and physical body simultaneously surpassed their limits. A slightly weaker soul would have long since died. However, Dedina still felt terrible. His stomach convulsed and food spurted out. His mucus and saliva flew everywhere. Even if his rationality repeatedly told him that the threat was over, he couldn't control his body at all. He could only use this method to vent his instinctive fear. That extremely embarrassing look didn't change just because he was a beauty. Dedina's stomach was completely empty with only water inside. Only then did she barely manage to recover a little. She lay paralyzed on the ground and took deep breaths, as if this was the only way to feel alive. Her sweat made her wet as if she had just been fished out of the water. But even though her legs were still trembling, she still forced herself to move. Even though her legs were still weak, she could still reluctantly accept having to stand on all fours. There's still time. Not far away was the altar of the twin goddesses that had already been reduced to ruins. Although the snow had left, and the altar that was buried under the snowfield was once again exposed, there were countless damaged areas. It was obvious that it could no longer be used. Chaos summoning. However, it was likely that most people had forgotten that the seemingly weak Dedina was actually the ruler of an entire level of the Chaos Abyss. Although Dedina's power was more dependent on her pets rather than herself. She was a demon lord who had both the Elven Empire and the demons. She was definitely a top-level mage. Numerous low-level and mid-level demons rushed out of the teleportation portal. However, they weren't given orders to kill. Dedina was incredibly fatigued, so she ordered them to work as laborers and repair the altar under her command. Summoning other demons was the most common racial talent that low-level demons possessed. However, demons didn't like to use this ability. That was because summoning existences of the same or higher level would have far too great of a price. They would have to respond to the summoning, and it would be quite easy for them to become mortal enemies. As for summoning weaker demons, what meaning would there be? However, succubi were an exception. Due to certain well-known reasons, succubi were quite popular among the Chaos Abyss lords. Many famous succubi had multiple demon lords as lovers. That was why even though succubi had the weakest combat strength among demons, nobody dared to force them. Demon Lord Dedina furiously opened a portal to the Chaos Abyss to summon her subordinates and high-level demons. The high-level demons then followed their master's orders to summon high-level and mid-level demons as well. The summoned demons speedily formed a new labor army. The low-level demons unhesitatingly followed their new master's orders when they saw the demon lord. However, the high-level demons had many schemes when they saw the exhausted demon lord, who was also a succubus who wasn't skilled at combat. But before they could do anything, the experienced Dedina directly found an excuse to execute 2 high-level demons who had been slacking off. She successfully made an example out of them and forcefully suppressed the possibility of a rebellion. Perhaps nobody would have expected that the person who designed this altar and the theory behind how to open the door was actually the seemingly inconspicuous Dedina. Perhaps nobody would have expected that this nameless, weak succubus was actually the most outstanding spatial magic master in the world. Only Dedina, who had obtained the Elven Empire's inheritance and knowledge of the Chaos Abyss, would be able to complete this miraculous project. It's finally going to be completed. Even though the repair work was progressing quite quickly, Dedina's anxiety didn't decrease at all. She still couldn't explain Roland's sudden appearance. Dedina still didn't feel safe at all. "Get out of my way!" Dedina whipped away the clumsy temporary labor. She couldn't wait any longer and directly took action herself, personally acting as the labor. "Finally, I can end everything. This damned holy war and cycle of reincarnation." Dedina was finally unable to calm down as she looked at the twin altar before her. Hadn't she waited for tens of thousands of years for this moment? Nobody knew that Dedina had been tightly holding onto a golden pendant that contained an old, dim yellow portrait. This was an item that she had retrieved from the ruins of the Elven Empire. This was a smiling, golden-haired elf girl who was weaving a flower garland for her parents. Her innocent appearance was truly cute. However, if Dedina herself saw this, she would probably unhesitatingly destroy this dark history. My pitiful Harloise, even to this day, I still don't dare to tell you who I am. Finally, today everything will end. Our long-cherished wish is right before us. For some reason, this expressionless succubus demon lord seemed just like a middle-aged man who was worried about personal gains and losses. Perhaps nobody expected that Dedina, who Roland viewed as nothing more than an accomplice, was actually the root of everything. The natural laws of chaos and order, fate and the gods' will, the inevitable replacement of the ruling species. From now on, there will be no natural laws. All life in Aichi shall obtain true freedom. Chapter 830. The Light of Sinsar Dub, a wise schemer, the legendary Elven Emperor Abolar VII, and now the succubus Dedina. Unlike human dynasties where the last emperors had abnormally short lifespans, the last emperors of long-lived species had more than enough time for humans to reproduce for several generations. This was more than enough time to judge an emperor's accomplishments and talents. Emperors weren't the rulers of a destroyed country, but they had the fate of a destroyed country. This was always given to the last emperors who tried to change the world. Abolar was probably one of the most unfortunate ones. When he took over, the Elven Empire was already in a terrible mess. Outside, the great demon empire was still powerful, but the humans were quietly rising up. The elf status as the ruling species was being challenged. Inside, the silver elves and moon elves rose up, challenging the gold elves' authority. The most unacceptable part was that the 4 superior elves were all working with other species. The Elven Empire's most precious treasure, magic, was being left behind in the world. The great demons had their own shaman and witchcraft systems, which didn't affect them much. The weak and short-lived humans had a chance to rise up. Abolar displayed his talents despite the internal and external problems. He supported the wild elves and mixed-blood elf elites to enter the Elven Empire's upper-class society, suppressing the increasingly powerful moon elves and creating a new balance. However, the Red Tribe opposed the Red Tribe's unyielding attitude towards the outside world, making it appear rather weak. The Red Tribe had always exercised restraint in the numerous border conflicts. Not only did the Red Tribe retreat towards the overbearing beastmen and great demons, the Red Tribe even made concessions towards the fragile human tribes. Abolar's style of ruling was like a coward who only knew how to fight amongst himself. Of course, he wouldn't be praised. However, it was likely that nobody could imagine what Abolar had been thinking back then. The elves have been the ruling species for far too long, to the point where even the cycle of reincarnation has stopped. Politicians only cared about the present because they wouldn't be able to survive without votes. However, politicians could see far into the future, far beyond the common people's understanding. In that generation, the Gold Elves were one of the few golden bloodlines that had survived from the immemorial era. The Gold Elves had witnessed the birth and origin of magic. Many of the Elven Elders had witnessed the immemorial God Wars. The Elven Empire had been powerful for far too long, to the point where new species couldn't possibly rise. The Elves were the strongest main gods in the world. Nearly half of the Order main gods were from the Elf God faction. The Emperor of the Elf Empire was also the most powerful and influential existence in the world. At Abolar's level, he was no longer just considering his own species. Of course, he knew about the unspoken rules of the Holy War. The elves weren't able to inherit the throne of the giants from the previous ruling species, not only because of luck. The Chaos Abyss would no longer allow the elves to continue blocking the path of evolution. As for the Order faction, let's not talk about the grudges accumulated between the Order faction, the Nature faction, and the ancient giant gods. The fact that the Order faction's population had an ever-decreasing fertility rate, to the point where it was even lower than the powerful angel species, was the best evidence of this world's attitude towards the Order faction. As for the Gold Elves, they only had a single newborn every few centuries. Even the dragons didn't have such a tragic experience. A race without newborns has no future. The higher we climb, the harder we fall. If we make a mistake in the next holy war, will our mortal enemies still give us a chance? The only thing the elves will face is the complete annihilation of the entire species. Abolar was the leader and helmsman of the elves. Abolar clearly knew that there were countless hidden rocks in the river in front of him, but he was still unable to stop this gigantic airship. Forcefully stopping the airship would also result in the destruction of everyone on board. That was why Abolar chose to fail. Perhaps the only way for the elves to continue existing was to accept their fated failure. Voluntarily stepping off the stage would be better than being kicked off the stage by others. The Gold Elves began to retreat from the upper echelons of the Elf Empire. The ancient gods began to enter a deep slumber. The Empire's borders began to shrink, and the humans and great demons began to take over those lands and resources. Abolar had almost succeeded. However, there were no ifs or misses in history. A ruler who constantly led his citizens to victory and a better life shouldn't be criticized. But to the elves, the foolish Abolar was only good at suppressing his citizens and manipulating the balance of power. He was nothing more than a coward who was afraid of even fighting with low-level creatures, humans. Evaluating a politician shouldn't be based on how he acted at the time. Instead, one should look at how he would develop after he left office. Seeds that would take years, decades, or even centuries to germinate would eventually bloom and bear fruit. Although the citizens had already forgotten about the person who had planted the seeds, future generations of historians would still be able to remember a few things. From a certain standpoint, Bowler had indeed succeeded. However, the betrayal of the superior elves caused the Gold Elves to become truly weak. The Gold Elves and gods' revenge against each other, as well as the superior elves' struggle for power, caused the Gold Elven Empire to gradually return to being a scattered, tribal society. The Gold Elves were forced to voluntarily retreat from the stage of history, but it was likely that this wasn't how Bowler had originally expected. Nobody would be able to resist the corruption of the River Styx, even if Bowler had once been a supreme existence. Only the newborn demon Dedina had managed to reach the surface of the River Styx. But perhaps because her hatred and stubbornness were too deep, or perhaps because she had died too pitifully, the newborn demon Dedina regained her memories from her previous life less than half a month after reaching the surface. As the Gold Elven Emperor, Bowler's knowledge, and experience caused the newborn demon Dedina to be incredibly anxious and frustrated. Half a month's worth of memories was destroyed by tens of thousands of years of memories. The newborn Dedina had many personalities that belonged to Bowler. Just like Eliza and Lisa's relationship, Bowler's resistance against the River Styx allowed the newborn demon Dedina to retain her old habits of thinking. But even though Bowler was incredibly anxious and intelligent, the newborn Dedina was still just an ordinary inferior demon. A militia that had been trained for 3 years would be able to deal with her with a shovel. Bowler would have to follow the rules of the Chaos Abyss and start over from scratch. There was no such thing as luck in the bloodshed of the Chaos Abyss. It would be several hundred years before Bowler truly had the power and opportunity to leave the Chaos Abyss. By the time he returned to the Gold Elf Empire, the palace had already been reduced to rubble. Bowler could only return to the Chaos Abyss with his personal belongings. Nobody knew better than him about the elves' research on divination and prophecy abilities. In order to escape from the newly born elven gods and the superior elves' pursuit, that's right, Bowler had chosen the path of a succubus, choosing to use another form of life form to complete his mission. Bowler was unable to meet with Heloise, even though he knew that his pure and innocent daughter had now become the Banshee Queen. Back then, the Gold Elf gods were all traitors. The Gold Elf gods were barely able to tolerate the existence of a harmless and weak succubus. That was because she hadn't even reached adulthood yet, and she was already dead. Showing some generosity was also a type of behavior. However, the Gold Elf gods were unable to accept a returning emperor. Bowler didn't dare to become too powerful, because too many gazes on him would only reveal his true identity. Then, the traitors would do everything in their power to kill him. In the end, Bowler became Bowler, a harmless succubus lord. Bowler also attempted to take revenge, but before her plan could be carried out, the target of her revenge died first. Far too many things had happened over the long years. The superior elves and their gods all met with misfortune. The Gold Elf Empire transformed into numerous elven tribes. Bowler's enemies all died. In fact, Bowler didn't even know who he should hate. Hate the traitors from back then? Hate the Gold Elf Empire's fated destruction? Bowler was wise and calm, but also pitiful. In the end, he turned his gaze to the cycle of reincarnation that had caused all of this. Even if we voluntarily give up, the cycle of reincarnation still won't let us go. Could it be that we're destined to have nowhere to run to? Who made it so that all of this would happen? The cycle of reincarnation will never end, and misfortune will never end. Perhaps nobody had expected that the person who had suggested this plan to Sophocles, to the god of evolution, to Cavendish, was this seemingly ordinary succubus. Even without her subordinates, Bowler still possessed wisdom and knowledge. This seemingly harmless diplomat was far more dangerous than a 1,000,000-strong army. Did Bowler want revenge? Did he want all life in the world to die together with the Gold Elf Empire? Did he want to save the world? Did he want to end the cycle of reincarnation? Perhaps even Bowler himself wouldn't be able to answer these questions. Anyways, I don't have anything left to treasure anymore. So let's gamble. Bowler had used Cavendish, and Cavendish had also used Bowler. Finally, the dimensional door was opened. When the sealed door of the crystal wall was opened, this world finally welcomed its destiny. Asterisk crack. Asterisk, the entire world didn't change at all. However, anyone with even the slightest bit of power would be able to sense that the dimensional door had been opened to this world. Countless outsiders could still see this world. Chapter 831. From the very beginning, the gate to the crystal wall had surpassed the understanding of mortals. It was not a door that actually existed, but an existence akin to rules and concepts. Even if it was just one step away from stepping out, the natives of this world would never be able to take that step. No, it would be more accurate to say that they simply could not see the way out. This was just like how fish couldn't leave the water and humans had to live on the ground. There was no need for an explanation at all. This was the rule, this was common sense. There were always exceptions to everything. There were always those special existences who found a loophole in the rules and successfully left this plane. But it never came back. After all, compared to preventing people from going out, this invisible door was originally used to stop visitors from the outside world. Outsiders who did not receive an invitation from the master could not enter this world. It was still possible to go out, but not a single one of them came back. The fact that there was no return once again shook the resolve of the fugitives. But was it true that no one had ever entered from the outside world? Not necessarily. Damn it. Nothing had changed in the outside world, but the situation on the battlefield had changed in an instant. The chaotic space began to disperse, as if something was beginning to dissipate. Above the pitch-black sky, there seemed to be countless pairs of eyes watching this place. The Chaos Abyss main gods that had just been attempting to surround and kill the god of holy light unhesitatingly turned around and vanished. Even if they were only escaping back to the Chaos Abyss to hide, it was still better than facing the unknown and becoming cannon fodder. The incredibly fatigued god of holy light sensed the faint presence of his will, which was why he stood up again. His mechanical and emotionless gaze swept over the battlefield, filled with broken bodies and corpses. The holy light gods were all trying to avoid the divine king's gaze, and the angels had all been wiped out. Finally, he retracted his gaze and fixed it on the sky. There, countless pupils were looking down. There, countless malice and wills had already solidified. The holy light flashed again, and the god of light flew up again. This time he was still alone. This time he did not look back. Purify, perhaps it was his mechanical thinking that determined his actions, or perhaps it was simply because this was the most optimal choice for the divine power server, or perhaps it was destined from the start, or perhaps he still had a bit of humanity left in him. Protect! The god of light turned into a pillar of light and faced the unknown. Scattered silver feathers fluttered down and covered the land. The god of holy light's sigh surprised me as well. Perhaps the world still underestimated him. But the next moment, I knew I couldn't just do nothing. Even if we were fighting each other to stop the door from opening. Now, the door has been opened, and we have lost the reason to fight. Even though the holy war between order and chaos was at its climax, even though both sides hated each other to the point of wanting to perish together, but now, the door was opened. Both sides were facing the possibility of external enemies. The two major factions no longer had any reason to kill each other. Is this what you want? I didn't receive an answer to my question. At this moment, Cavendish sank into a rare moment of deep thought. Could it be that he finally realized that he had made a huge mistake and was regretting it? Damn it, yes. This body is too weak. How can I go out and have fun? Carwin smiled. His smile was filled with malice, as if he wanted to see my reaction. But me? Instead, he felt like laughing. Was there anything I didn't understand about this fellow? It was impossible to hope that he would regret and reflect on himself from the very start. However, he was definitely regretting it now, and the reason was right in front of him. Hey, can't you be a little gentler? This is your precious granddaughter's body, isn't it? I unhesitatingly punched Cavendish's lower abdomen. The tremendous pain caused his expression to distort. Before he could even react, I broke his ankle and knocked him unconscious with a single punch. Let's just treat this pain as interest for my early harvest. After taking care of him, it was my turn to have a headache. While Cavendish was trapped in this physical body, I was also trapped in this physical body. Our physical bodies? They were already dead. Not only were they dead, if my inference was correct, both my and Cavendish's main god-level physical bodies had become sacrifices necessary to open the door to the holy light. Not only that, sacrifices that were delivered to our doorstep. There's not much time left. We need to hurry. I unhesitatingly walked out while carrying Cavendish. I didn't have much time left, and there were still many things I needed to do. The god of holy light, who had been preventing the door from opening, was now the first to face the unknown. This made me feel rather complex emotions. But no matter what, we now had a pathfinder. No matter what the god of holy light would encounter, we would at least have more time to prepare. Let's think on the bright side. Perhaps the god of holy light will be even more weakened outside. The god of holy light will be able to defeat everything. This was probably the first time that I had ever hoped for the god of holy light to win. But the next moment, I couldn't smile anymore. Asterisk boom. Asterisk, a soundless explosion spread through the world. At that moment, all the god of holy light statues shattered, and all the devout believers started crying. On the battlefield, large numbers of angels chose to commit suicide in despair. The death of a god caused everything to descend into chaos. The god of holy light has died. Wonderful. It seems that there are many. I unhesitatingly stabbed Cavendish in the head. The only reason why I didn't seal him away or directly send him into the river Styx was because Cynthia's knowledge would likely become very important at a time like this. I looked up at the sky. Even though I knew that the sky wasn't the way out, I could sense countless malicious intents gathering. The only reason why they hadn't chosen to enter was that they were gathering and testing the waters. Meanwhile, in the chaos abyss, Didina, who had just been praying, was now half kneeling on the ground with a pained expression. Her gaze pierced through the pitch-black darkness. She could also sense the god of holy light's death, as well as the endless malicious intents. Did I lose the gamble? Chapter 832. Even though there was clearly nothing in the sky, it would always steal everyone's attention, intentionally or otherwise. Is this the calm before the storm? It was now the 17th day since the dimensional barrier had been opened. The anticipated storm still hadn't arrived. The entire mortal plane was abnormally calm. The unending war that had been going on for more than 10 years had finally stopped. All sorts of information and guesses were spread all over the mortal plane. The ancient gods had reappeared in the mortal plane, and there was a tremendous amount of news every day. However, there was no actual information. The fairies furiously moved about the entire world in search of information about possible enemies. In the mage country, the most ancient books had been dug up. However, it was likely that the book's history wasn't enough to record the secrets of the ancient gods' wars ever, since they were written in modern languages. The god of holy light's sudden death not only shocked the mortal plane, but also caused panic. In the world where the strongest and undying existences lived, the god of holy light represented the strongest main god. He was an undefeatable existence. Even though he had been weakened by war and the chaos main god, the fact that such an existence had instantly died in the outside world was something that ordinary people couldn't understand. However, for ordinary people, the Holy Light Church's collapse and the death of the supreme god of holy light was a destructive reality. Panic, anxiety, and despair. Even though the fact that the dimensional barrier had been opened hadn't spread among ordinary people yet. Just the fact that holy light had been extinguished was more than enough to cause a tidal wave of despair. As a true god died, a large number of true god priests lost their ability to cast spells and their source of power. Divine job class members who borrowed divine power experienced the special feeling of losing their connection to divine power. Some priests went insane, while others chose to commit suicide. Most fell into despair and despair. This was not Earth, where religion was mysterious. In this world where there was a true God, the Church was the representative of the God on earth. The God was also the supporter and the object of worship of the Church. When the true God fell, his Church would naturally lose its meaning of existence. The Holy Church, which had priests and bishops as its core, was collapsing at an inconceivable speed. Pope Coloma, one of the Holy Church's higher-ups, directly committed suicide. More than 70% of the bishops lost their ability to move. The collapse of faith affected all of human society. If this chaos continued, it was easy to foresee that human society would collapse before any invaders from the outside world arrived. Fortunately, in this world, there was more than one God whose divine domain was holy light. At the critical moment when the holy light was about to be destroyed, the southern sect and the Hades stood up and decided to become idols. Ahem. I meant that they decided to use the Hades pillar of holy light to become the new main god of holy light. This is only a replacement for the God of Holy Light. It's just a temporary chaos. The old God of Holy Light is tired, so he chose the strongest Holy Knight, Estrada, as his successor. Who would believe such nonsense? No matter if you believe it or not, at least I believe it. Cough! Actually, as long as a lie has value, as long as there are enough benefits, there will naturally be people who will cover their ears and pretend to be deceived. Rather than completely overthrowing a regime, it would be better to change a new leader, which would definitely cause far less panic. As for whether or not we would need to settle old debts, that would be a matter for the future. The core of human society, the Holy Church, had split up. Some chose to ally with us and become members of the new Southern sect. To them, perhaps it was just a new statue with a new face and a new name when praying. Their belief in the God of Holy Light would still allow them to use the God of Holy Light as a divine power server and obtain power. The teachings of pure Holy Light were much easier to follow than the original teachings. As for the other half, no matter if it was because they were unwilling to accept reality or because they had a grudge against the Hades, they chose to self-exile. However, there was no meaning in doing so. After all, they had lost their power. The God they believed in had perished. As believers who refused to accept reality and prayed to an existence of nothingness, they were essentially no different from believers of evil gods. Meanwhile, the Holy Light faction gods had no intentions of accepting a new main god. They returned to the upper planes and didn't bother with the changes happening in the mortal plane. It seemed that they were prepared to wait for future developments before making a decision. Most god factions had made the same decision. The Chaos main gods returned to the depths of the Chaos abyss, while the Nature faction hid in their own subplanes and peacefully became cowards. The Hades faction began taking over the Holy Church's inheritance. Taking over the Holy Church's worldly wealth was the equivalent of taking over the Holy Church's countless roots in human society. The God of Holy Light was only 1/4 of the four-pillar gods Hades faction. The God of Holy Light was also beginning to spread, and it was possible that the God of Holy Light would be able to replace the Holy Light faction. Perhaps, given several hundred years and several generations, the Hades faction's path of law and order would become the new mainstream of society. However, in the eyes of many, the Hades faction's current actions were foolish, short-sighted, and suicidal. They're not only taking over wealth and power, they're also taking over the responsibility of fighting against the outsiders. Now that they have control over the situation, they have no path of retreat. They've become the first living targets. But if I had to say, those cowards who hid in their nests and waited for others to become cannon fodder, passively waiting for the situation to develop, were the truly foolish ones. Hide? Where can they hide and wait for others to become cannon fodder? This time, there's really nowhere to hide. Nobody knew better than me just how frightening the outsiders from the outside world were. After all, the goddess of order had recently been constantly feeding me information about how powerful the outsiders were, even if that information was definitely outdated by several dozen or even several million years. The Void Distorter is a gigantic ball of distorted light. He can devour anything, including gods and titans. But his true body isn't even in this world. The crystal-heavy fish isn't a fish at all. He's an incredibly frightening soul devourer. Any life form that gets close to him will have their soul absorbed. And the crystal-heavy fish has innumerable supernatural abilities. I read out all this information to the fairies and then sent them to every corner of the world. But in order to avoid unnecessary panic, I also told them that I would only send this information to the local authorities and organizers if the monsters mentioned in the information truly appeared. This was necessary. Not only were the fairies frightened by this information, even I could somewhat understand what the goddesses of order and chaos had done back in the day after reading this information. Let's do our best and leave it to fate. Although there's a 99% chance that it'll be meaningless, it'll still be better to have an extra chance of victory if we really meet. Soon, I learned that this wasn't an unnecessary action. Those ancient existences still existed in the outside world, and this time they were still the vanguard. A meteor shower has appeared in the Queso Mountains. There are traces of the Void Distorter appearing. Chapter 833. Calamities would always descend from the heavens, and bad news would always follow. Justice would always be shot down from the heavens before it could even descend. Cough, cough. Whenever you heard bad news, even more bad news would always be on the way. After the first eyewitness report arrived, more and more news about invaders from other dimensions arrived. Most of these invaders weren't on my list of information, but the few that were confirmed were still inconceivably powerful. It seemed that war was about to descend upon this land, filled with calamities once again. Every day I would hear about a new war, although the gods would actively participate, and the final victors of these small-scale battles would always be the defending side. Everyone knew that something was wrong with the situation. In the eyes of those who were observant, these invaders were nothing more than the first signs. That was because, according to the rules of war, only the cannon fodder and scouts would enter unfamiliar enemy territory first. Even if these cannon fodder were so powerful that the gods would have to deal with them, the result of the Queso Mountains being attacked by a large number of Void Distorters was that only 2 powerful gods would attack and raze the entire mountain range to the ground. Not everyone would be mysteriously confident that they would always be victorious. Only a battle maniac would blindly attack when there was insufficient information and gamble on the fate of their country. In normal situations, armies and powerful individuals who would be able to make the final decision would only consider entering the battlefield when there was sufficient information. Meanwhile, we could sense that more and more people were observing us from the outside world, and they were becoming more and more powerful. Even if they still didn't choose to enter the dimensional barrier, fear and despair were spreading more and more. Renee was currently recovering from a sudden illness in her harem. Galena was the only senator left in the Mist Alliance. All I could do was do my best to ensure that the Mist Alliance survived this calamity. The invaders appeared quite casually. It seemed as if they were invading and attacking, but more often than not they were probing. I personally fought several times. Perhaps it was because even the invaders from other dimensions felt that the Northlands was far too barren, so the invaders weren't particularly strong. The Aurora Knight Squadron and Big Dipper Squadron easily wiped out the invaders. However, everyone knew that this was only a sign that a storm was brewing. How's the plan going? Not so good. Most of the people who won the lottery don't want to leave. They believe that things haven't reached this stage yet. Let's have the volunteers board the Ark first. On the other side, the final Doomsday Ark plan was also forcefully activated. The portal leading to the Land of Spring, the main plane of the Hades, had a daily flow of hundreds of thousands of people, but it was still not enough. If the situation of the war in the future was bad, as long as all the portals were cut off, the Land of Spring and the Hades that were bound to it would have nothing to do with Aichi. A new crystal wall would isolate all spies. Humans, beastmen, and elves all loved being on ships. HE's seed could also sprout on new soil, preserving the last spark of civilization and species. But until the very last step, nobody wanted to leave their own world. It wasn't that I didn't have much confidence in the future battles. It was just that I was used to calculating for failure before calculating for victory. At the very least, I had to leave a path of retreat for myself. Ale and the others also agreed with my judgment. Judging from the most recent information, the gods of the Hades, Holy Light, and Nature factions had all appeared. On the other hand, it seemed that the elemental tide had become even more active now that the dimensional door had been opened. Our lives had become much better. But from another perspective, perhaps this was also a necessary condition for the invaders to enter this world, just like how the main gods and powerful gods had been restricted from entering the mortal plane in the past. How much longer do we have to wait? Soon. The silly cat couldn't take it anymore, so she jumped onto the windowsill and closed her eyes to rest. Amelia took over the rest of the shifts. It was worth mentioning that Harloise actually managed to survive after being taught a good lesson by Eliza. And now that the dimensional door had been opened, Eliza no longer needed to stop me, so she returned to my side. Of course, I welcomed the return of such a powerful combat strength. After all, Eliza was still as unfathomably powerful as ever. However, Harloise and Amelia didn't seem to trust her. They insisted that I needed someone to protect me, so they started taking 2 shifts. Right now, I was sitting on Glena's small stool and dealing with government affairs. Amelia was in the living room drinking tea and reading a book. She also kept an eye on the strongest existence in the world who was wearing maid attire and seriously cleaning the windows. Since there wasn't much time left, I decided to let her do as she pleased. Nobody would be able to defeat her, and since she liked cleaning, I would let her do it. She had a dark expression on her face, which indicated that she hadn't been in a good mood recently. This was because she would occasionally explode her ki and release her aura to gather mana. She would do something that would attract attention, but wouldn't cause any actual damage. She would occasionally cause some trouble. Harloise and Amelia were the ones who were tired and needed to change shifts. I knew that Eliza was looking for an opportunity to vent her anger, while Harloise and Amelia were mysteriously in the wrong. The end result was that we tacitly agreed to let Eliza do whatever she wanted. The atmosphere in my small courtyard was becoming increasingly tense. Semi-gods and main gods were mysteriously fighting against each other, and mortals were the ones suffering when the gods fought. Some people were already fainting for no reason while walking around. I heard that the servants and administrative staff were already starting to shift the responsibility of reporting to me to one another. Eliza, there's a group of uninvited ants in Ice River Town. Go take care of them. At this time, Eliza would be quite convenient. With her help, the Northlands would become the safest place in the world. Her temporary departure also allowed us to heave a sigh of relief. How much longer? Amelia silently closed her book and asked something that came out of nowhere. Wow, what did you say? Oh, Ice River Town is quite far. Even Eliza will need 4 or 5 hours to take care of it. Don't play dumb. You know what I'm asking. I silently sighed. Actually, even I didn't know how to answer this question. A few hours? Tomorrow? A few days? A few months? To be honest, I don't know how much longer I can last, but I'll definitely last longer than that guy. Amelia silently looked at me. She didn't say anything, but her slightly red eyes and calm gaze made me feel like I was unable to endure it. I'm sorry, I had no other choice. I knew that guy would be difficult to deal with, but I didn't expect him to be so difficult. You should know just how dangerous it was back then. I could only go all out. She was such a strong girl. Her silent tears stopped me from explaining anything. I'm sorry. In the end, I could only give a weak explanation. Roland, you're going to die. I was unable to refute the silly cat's words. Yep, I was going to die, or rather, I was already dead. It wasn't that I was interested in staying in Glena's physical body. My physical body and Cavendish's had already perished together. Our souls were probably still soaking in the river Styx. Right now, the only thing that was forcefully staying in the mortal plane was my will. As the river Styx corroded me, it was unknown just how much longer this will of mine would be able to last. Eliza's judgment was correct. My duel with Cavendish would only end in mutual destruction. Her betrayal was only to avoid this possibility. Amelia and Harloise were in the wrong when it came to Eliza. Perhaps this was the final result, which was still unacceptable. This time, when both of our souls fell into the river Styx, the cycle of reincarnation finally caught us as illegal immigrants. There was no longer any reason for me to show mercy. I could sense the river Styx's summoning at all times. I could also sense that my soul was becoming weaker and weaker, but at least for now. Harloise, can you have some conscience? No matter what, I'm still your master, and I've fed you so much cat food. Meow, of course I remember. I'm your magical pet. If you die, I die. Isn't it just a trial of the Hades and an execution in hell? We agreed long ago that we could just go together. Yep, we can finally have a good rest. We should be happy. Master, thanks to your magical pet contract. Even if we reincarnate, we'll still be together. Harloise, your words really moved me. But could you not smile at Amelia while saying that? If you were dissatisfied with your magical pet contract, we could cancel it. Senpai was already smiling dangerously at such an obvious provocation. Amelia seemed to be hesitating. In the end, there were some words that she didn't say out loud. She was the main god of the wood spirits, the true form of the forest of dreams. If she died, the entire wood spirits would die together with her. Amelia was unable to make such a promise. Right, how about I write a will as well? I should first destroy all the books in my old residence. Also, should I give my collection to Adam for safekeeping? Forget it. Marguerite will find them every 2 days and burn them. It'll be so pitiful if news that Roland's belongings were erotic books or something like that. I shook my head as I considered my own future. Although it was likely that other men wouldn't have such a chance in their lifetimes, it would be far too frightening. So I decided to stop here. As I leisurely considered all this nonsense, I was also nearing the end of my work. Actually, there was no way I could finish all the government affairs. It was already quite commendable that I was working so hard. Our current situation was actually quite bad. The entire world was in a bad situation. We're like sheep waiting to be slaughtered. The god of holy light had gone out and then been instantly killed. This proved that going out would be suicidal. If I didn't go out, that would be the equivalent of handing the initiative to the enemy. I knew that I was doing nothing right now. I was only using work to pass the time of anxiousness. I was preparing the ark while waiting for the final invasion that would eventually arrive. If I don't hurry up, I won't be able to wait. I helplessly looked at my small, tender hands. My previously rosy skin had turned pale and icy. Wearing an undead spirit on a living person's body for too long was causing more and more damage to Galena. Galena's physical body's subconscious rejection of me was also becoming more and more obvious. In my current state, with an undead spirit possessing my physical body, I should count as a lich. But before I could sigh about how the world was unpredictable and how the cycle of reincarnation was impossible to predict, the window suddenly opened, and a pale moon in the sky attracted our attention. It was currently late at night, but there were 2 moons in the sky. We didn't even need to think to tell that these were real moons. That was because H's moon definitely wouldn't have a gigantic mouth that was half the size of a planet, nor would it have an incredibly evil and greedy expression as if it was looking at the entire world, as if it was looking at delicious cheesecake. And now it was opening its gigantic mouth and tearing at the moon of H's world. At this moment, the moon god's soundless screams of pain echoed in everyone's ears. However, nobody was able to do anything about it. Star-swallowing demon god, the the leader of those bandits. Chapter 834. Patricia's pitiful screams echoed in every living creature's ears. The moon that was being devoured gave everyone the most direct expression of despair. Damn it, the Starlight Network. The moon wasn't the moon god's true body. Rather, it was the concept of her existence. It was just like how the god of holy light would naturally cease to exist if the concept of holy light was erased. As a former order god, Patricia had the same weakness. Along with her existence, the Starlight Network that she had sacrificed most of her divine power to create was torn apart. Any existences from the outside world that invaded the mortal plane would be marked by the omnipresent Starlight King. They would also be watched by the moon god and the fate god. This seemingly insignificant design had actually been used multiple times on the battlefield. Dimensional invaders that were marked would become the local residents' prey. They would expose their location and information on the battlefield. No matter how powerful they were, they would still be the prey. This powerful forbidden spell, maintained by the two main gods of the Hades, would still be effective even without the Holy War system. Recently, no matter how the invaders from other dimensions entered this world, as long as they chose to enter the most fertile main plane, they would be instantly marked by the net of stars, and then countless hunters would be waiting for them. This forbidden spell was split into two parts. One was controlled by the former fate god, and the other was controlled by the moon god Patricia. These two gods had been weakened after casting the forbidden spell, so they hid in the Hades. However, the star-devouring demon god seemed to have found a way to break through the forbidden spell. Moon god, no, I definitely can't let her die here. Anxiety was meaningless. She could only see the near future. If the moon was truly devoured by the mortal plane, then Patricia wouldn't just lose her concept of existence. She would also lose the source of her faith. Since the moon was gone, what meaning would there be in being a moon god? And if the two main gods of the star net died, the entire star net would instantly collapse. The contract hero system and defense system built upon it would naturally become useless. Even if it wouldn't instantly return to the chaotic era where everyone was fighting for their lives, it would still require a large amount of time and human resources to make up for it. But what if I stopped the star-devouring demon god? I would have to find a wild, dead star fortress. Patricia, remember this. You've long since ceased to be the moon god. You're the master of starlight of the Hades divine system. The starlight net is the concept that you should have. The moon is only one of the many stars. You haven't lost your existence. You've simply improved your own existence. Since there was no way to stop it, he could only think of a way to protect Patricia first. Perhaps these words were just a game of words, but they provided a way of thinking. From the moment they entered the Hades, the moon god was no longer the moon god. If the moon was viewed as a member of the stars, then the moon god would become a lower concept of the Lord of the Stars. If they only lost a lower concept, although it would still be a heavy loss, at least they wouldn't die on the spot. If this had been any other god or region, it would have been impossible to change the concept. However, Patricia was the goddess of Hades, and as the creator of Hades and one of the four pillar gods, she had the authority to change divine concepts. She had all the necessary seals, documents, and procedures. Changing divine concepts was completely in accordance with the procedures. As long as they acted quickly enough, they should be able to protect Patricia. Patricia! In the name of the four pillar gods of Hades, we promote you to be the Lord of the Stars. The voices of the four pillar gods echoed in Patricia's ears. Patricia's screams finally stopped. Although she was still weakening, the moon god was still an important part of her existence. At the very least, she wouldn't be completely destroyed. However, H's moon was gone. It was likely that she wouldn't be the only one who would suffer. As expected, the internet has been disconnected. Although the moon was still a member of the stars, Patricia had used the moon as the core to create the star web. Now that the core was gone, even if the network was still there, it had lost its function. In this strange world that couldn't be perceived by the naked eye, Everything was losing its light. The originally bright silver star web was now withered and dying. But as long as the core and the network were still there, rebuilding was only a matter of time, as long as the moon god would give us time. In everyone's eyes, the moon had already been devoured by the demon god. All that was left were pieces of wreckage, floating in midair, neither going up nor down, like leftover biscuit pieces. That planet-sized demon god didn't seem to be full yet. He had already turned his attention to the ground. He was moving at a speed that seemed slow, but was actually incredibly fast. Judging from the direction he was moving, he was attempting to descend onto Aichi. Following his descent were countless tiny black dots. But if one got close enough, they would discover that even the shortest of these foreign invaders was more than 10 meters tall. I absolutely can't let him descend onto Aichi. At this moment, I definitely wasn't the only one who was thinking this. In the upper planes, Mountain Paradise's dimensional door opened wide, and countless angels flew out. Under the leadership of the gods, they faced the demon god who intended to destroy the world. In the chaos abyss, an ancient demon lord and a powerful demon opened a dimensional door to the mortal plane. Demons and angels actually became allies. In the nature faction and the elemental planes, powerful existences that had been forgotten by everyone else all jumped out one after another. They were fighting for themselves, as well as for the world itself. Even if it was a futile attempt to stop a chariot, a mantis that was forced into a corner would still struggle one last time. I shook my head and got up, preparing to take action. The entire Hades faction started moving as well. Ale and the other four-pillar gods' illusory figures were almost tangible. But just as everyone was about to despair, countless rays of light appeared. A torrent of light engulfed the invaders in midair. Along with them was hope. 350 star hours ago, we received a dimensional request for assistance from an individual named Roland Ka. We learned that this plane is currently being invaded by other planes. According to the Guardian Oath of Friendship between all intelligent creatures in the universe, we have come to provide assistance. Dimensional doors opened one after another, and our allies of steel walked out from them. Chapter 835. Countless beams of light spewed out from the dimensional gate, and what appeared in a flash were groups of steel warships. There were round, square, cylindrical, small boats, huge airships, and all sorts of gigantic ships. Most of them were metal battleships, but there were also some strange-looking, gigantic creatures. Who's calling for an airship fleet? Something's wrong with this scene. I rubbed the corner of my eyes, unable to believe what I was seeing. I could clearly see humanoid black dots within the battleships. Individual transmigration? A magical girl with a magical staff? I think I need some 58-point all-purpose medicine. System, exchange for 2 bottles of sorghum liquor for me first. Also, is there anything you'd like to say? The world is huge. I was rendered speechless. This was doubtlessly useless. Once a sealed dimensional door was opened, who knew what was outside? Of course the world was huge. However, the battle in the sky hadn't ended yet. Thanks to the star-devourer demon god's tremendous size, it was likely that anyone could see this battle. The gigantic planet creature was still unable to directly fight against the torrent of light created by the battleships. From the moment that the gigantic airship fleet appeared, it unhesitatingly turned around and ran. But judging from how well the chaotic allied airship fleet was able to do so, perhaps this wasn't the first time. What I cared about the most were the stats of some of the airships. Isn't that a Gundam? Although it's obviously a shrunken version. It was destroyed. There's actually someone inside? That's not a gigantic robot, but a spacesuit that looks like a Gundam? Why does that saucer-shaped airship look so familiar? Is it the Enterprise? It seems that I've met someone from the same world. Aichi had been sealed off for so many years. Occasionally, powerful individuals would find a way to leave by themselves, but I'd never heard of anyone from the outside successfully entering Aichi. Were there really no outsiders here? Not necessarily. I, Roland, was a transmigrator with memories from my previous world. And if I remembered correctly, these airships with stats were all from famous sci-fi movies and anime back in the day. Rather than saying that some world just happened to develop from movies and anime, I was more convinced that those nerdy shut-in airship engineers who flew into space used a different method to continue their favorite culture. It was just like playing with plastic figurines until they were 1-to-1, or playing with real Gundams that were several buildings tall. If that was the case, there was only one possibility. It hasn't even been 100 years, and Earth has actually developed to such an extent. Now that I think about it, this seems to be unexpected but reasonable. When I left, I remember that it was the year 201X. At that time, space technology had already landed in the sky and explored the endless universe. Based on the speed of technological advancement back then, given another 400 years and 20 generations of development, it was entirely possible for them to develop into the space battleship Yamato by the year 24XX, provided that everyone didn't get too excited and end up fighting over nuclear wastelands and trash. Judging from the fact that more than half of the fleet was designed in the style of my homeworld and was designed in typical human styles, it was highly likely that my homeworld, Earth, wasn't far away from Aichi. My system was rendered speechless. I had considered this possibility before, but even the goddess of order wasn't sure when I would arrive in this world. If I didn't open the dimensional door, I wouldn't even know how far away Earth was from Aichi. Since they only came here after receiving Roland's request for reinforcements, then I more or less knew what had happened. If there was light, then there would be darkness. If there were bandits, then there would be police. If there were wolves, then there would be sheep. No, I didn't say it was the opposite. In this day and age, sheep were far more powerful than wolves. A wolf-eating sheep had long since become an epic quest. A certain undying superwolf wouldn't be able to complete it even after several thousand episodes. Cough! I was thinking that although Roland's thoughts were quite mechanical, his mechanical logic was completely based on theory and possibility. Since there were so many hungry hunters out there, then perhaps there would be hunters who would manage and fight against these wild beasts. Since this was the most likely way to save the world, then I might as well carry it out. With so many coming, it's possible that Roland self-destructed because he was outnumbered. For gods, the physical body is power and power is will. A god's shard of light might be the best way to ask for reinforcements in this world. I felt that my guess was correct, but my system rejected it with an abnormally heavy tone. That's impossible. Actually, I already knew how Roland died half a month ago. I didn't tell you because it was rather embarrassing. Embarrassing? He valiantly blocked the dimensional door and faced countless gigantic gods and monsters. He valiantly fought until the very last moment and even self-destructed to send a distress signal. How could that be embarrassing? Even I had changed my opinion of Roland. No, there shouldn't have been any fighting. You should know that Roland is an order god, a pure god of faith. And the area outside the dimensional door isn't within the service area of the power of faith. I thought about this for a moment before coming to a realization. Roland rushed out, but before he even met any enemies, he discovered that he had no signal. Although there was silence, this was doubtlessly a type of tacit agreement. From a certain standpoint, this was indeed rather foolish. Although Roland was an enemy in the past, I feel that his act of asking for help will leave behind a glorious legacy in history. Perhaps he'll even become a hero who saves the world, becoming the idol of worship for future generations. For the sake of the entire Aichi's reputation, let's pretend that we don't know anything at this time. I could already imagine how awkward Roland must have been at the time. The gods of faith were inseparable from faith. Roland himself was the accumulation of countless faith origin forces. When Roland rushed out of Aichi, that meant that he had cut off his own source of faith. He was just like a kite with a broken string, unable to return. A Nokia with no signal could only be used to block bullets. When Roland discovered that he was rapidly weakening to the point of death, Then he probably discovered that he wouldn't be able to survive no matter what, so he unhesitatingly chose to self-destruct. No wonder he died so quickly. Since Roland died so quickly, we had a rather high opinion of the outside world's average power level. It seemed that we were being a bit too high. Now it seems that this Star Eater is much smaller than the one we met back in the day. It's likely that it's still in its infancy, so it shouldn't be that difficult to deal with. As long as it descends into HE, it'll have to modify itself according to HE's rules. According to our calculations back in the day, although its descent will definitely cause severe damage, it'll be weakened by the world's natural laws. You 2 brothers alone should be enough to deal with it. Us 2 brothers? 2 main gods would be enough? All right then. The Star Eater was weaker than expected. In that case, the chaotic airships that needed to band together in order to deal with the Star Eater weren't as strong as expected? Judging from how disorganized the Star Eater was, it indeed seemed like a temporary organization made up of random troops. I silently calculated that as long as technology and magical engineering had a foundation, it would enter a period of rapid development. Judging from how fast HE's magical engineering technology was progressing, it wouldn't be long before the Star Eater's airships left the atmosphere. Perhaps in less than 300 or 400 years, our airships would also be able to enter outer space, and we would be able to plant the seeds of civilization among the stars, becoming a true interstellar civilization. At this moment, the Star Eater had completely retreated in defeat. However, the Star Eater's airships had no intentions of continuing to chase after it. They stopped in midair, giving the gods and mortals an invisible pressure. Announcement: we have expelled the Silver Star Destroyer, a space pirate with a threat level of 15,623. We have fulfilled our obligation to rescue all intelligent life forms in the Overwatch contract. We first discovered that your civilization has already developed to the point of being able to leave the planet as an individual, which meets the minimum requirements for a B-level world to join the Overwatch contract. According to the 3rd clause of the contract, we, as B-level veterans, invite your civilization to join the Overwatch contract. An agreement to rescue each other? What a familiar routine. A United Nations from the interstellar era? TSK, it would seem that it's the same everywhere. There are wolves, hunters, and societies. The small world has been opened, and the outside world is different. In midair, a gigantic projection was floating with mysterious runes. However, no matter who it was, no matter which species it was, they would be able to understand this ancient and solemn contract without any doubt. Overwatch contract for intelligent life forms. 1. You're not alone. You are not the only one. Every encounter between intelligent life forms in the endless universe is a miracle worthy of praise. Please put down the butcher's knife in your hands and heart and search for the possibility of communication. 12. Watching, protecting, and aiding each other is the duty of every intelligent life form. 17. All power originates from the soul. Soul power, magic, technology, and intelligence are essentially the same. Do not discriminate against other civilizations or individuals at any time. Many clauses of the contract attracted my attention. There was far too much knowledge and rules that I could study in detail, but my vision was already becoming hazy. It would seem that I had suddenly felt that there was nothing to worry about and had become too relaxed. My obsession had disappeared, and it was time to report to the River Styx. I was rather hesitant, but when I thought about how troublesome it would be to deal with those aliens, I was delighted that I could successfully become someone who did nothing. Does this count as me being willing to die rather than go to work? This is impossible. Mom. It's actually Mom. What could make the venerated goddess of order be so scared that she would call me Mom? Could it be that she was the new version of Little May's mom? Cough, cough. It seemed rather amusing to make such a comment before dying. I forced myself to focus and did my best to recognize the contract, but I was almost scared to the point of calling her Mom. At the very bottom of the contract were the signatures of 12 ancient existences. They were probably the first signatories of the Overwatch contract, which was why they had left their own signatures on the original contract. Their names were the concept of their existences. Just looking at them would allow me to sense how immeasurably powerful they were. And the fifth signatory seemed so familiar. He. Chapter 836. I'm so unlucky. How could it be like this? Everything ended before I even had a chance to cause a scene? This shouldn't be the case. Roland, it's all your fault. Hurry up, idiot. I still want to find an old friend to hear the latest news. Of course, I wouldn't bother with Cavendish's nagging. We had just reached the shore not long ago. Towering black mountains surrounded us on both sides. The only silver path led to a distant palace. The familiar black-gray sky before us made me sigh in amazement. The Hades. I never expected to arrive here. Cavendish's sigh was filled with memories. Perhaps it was this battle in the Hades that changed the path of the entire world. For Cavendish, he had broken free from the will of the Chaos Abyss's control here. He had obtained Cynthia's knowledge and memories, and obtained complete freedom. That was why he had the thought of opening the door and causing a scene. As for me, the establishment of the Hades also meant that the cycle of despair had been cut off. We had avoided the worst possible ending and an unstoppable misfortune. It could be said that this battle in the River Styx had changed the fate of the entire world. This change would only have greater and greater effects in the future. The collapse of the Holy Light system was supposed to have been a complete destruction. The resulting chaos in politics, nations, countries, and species, as well as the other ambitious species, was more than enough to instantly reduce the ruling human species to second-rate status. Once a king lost his crown, the new nobles who took over the throne wouldn't give him a chance to rise again. But now, the Holy Light system of the Hades had replaced this broken outer layer. As long as we could survive this period of time, many situations would be different. This meant that the Hades would have a more moderate version of the pure Holy Light teachings. This would completely replace the original radical version of the Holy Light teachings. Plus, the Hades faction was a temporary government made up of many different species to begin with. Racial discrimination would be greatly reduced. Although it was impossible to completely eliminate racial discrimination, it was now time to stop foolishly killing the children of other species as heroes. Really, I should thank those friends in the sky. I knew a little about the viciousness of the human heart. No matter how friendly these visitors from the outside world seemed, no matter how neutral the treaty seemed, no matter how loud the slogan of not interfering with the internal affairs of other species and worlds sounded, as long as those iron battleships were still floating in the sky, there was still a possibility that the star-devouring demon would return. In that case, with such an external enemy existing, the He People's society would become much more peaceful, and the differences between species would be greatly reduced. Intelligent creatures had a bad habit that stemmed from their survival instincts. They always liked to draw a circle. Those outside the circle were their enemies, and those inside the circle were their friends. Then they could use high-sounding reasons to clean up and expel their enemies, throwing the blame for the mistakes and tragic reality onto their enemies. As a result, they monopolized resources and space for development. The so-called connections, the so-called small groups, the so-called opposing classes, the so-called various struggles, in the final analysis, were nothing more than a thread needed by the human heart. This thread could be religion, race, skin color, ethnicity, or even gender, region, accent, education level, whether tofu pudding was sweet or savory. This seemed to have brought up a taboo topic, in order to not become a battle between the sweet and savory factions. Let's stop here. Earth's history was clearly one where species had never stopped fighting. In He, where many species coexisted, wars and conflicts had never stopped. In a non-holy war, race and religion were the most common reasons for war. And when it came to fighting between species of the same species, it would be even easier to come up with many reasons. Since there were benefits to be fought over Any random line drawn would be enough to cause a bloody battle. In a holy war, the order and chaos factions would be a natural line. And now, there was an additional line between the original residents of Aichi and the visitors from the outside world. In that case, it could be expected that things would be much more peaceful within this line. And if I'm not mistaken, that Overwatch agreement isn't just an empty written document. Although it definitely has many flaws and loopholes, the wills of the 12 powerful existences are more than enough to make it more effective than a soul contract. By the way, thank you for opening the door. I'm guessing that the world will become much more peaceful because of this. Should I suggest awarding you a Roland Peace Prize? I smiled in delight as I sincerely expressed my gratitude to Cavendish. Then, I happily watched as my younger brother, who had a bad temper, flew into a rage. The process? For me, who only cared about results, the process wasn't important at all. Only an idiot like Cavendish would be satisfied after causing a huge ruckus. What do you mean success or failure isn't important? Only the process is important? That's probably just a loser's way of consoling himself. Why lose if you can win? No matter how beautiful the process is, if the result is a complete mess, are you trying to put on a show for others to watch? Or are you just an artist who seeks to satisfy himself? I've always been a results-oriented person. My motto is to seek victory at all costs and by all means. And now, it's time for me to enjoy the fruits of my victory and laugh at this idiot who worked so hard for nothing and even lost his life. You're laughing at me? Didn't you lose your own life in the end? According to what you said, you could have just watched me open the door. Why did you have to sacrifice yourself? This time it was my turn to feel aggrieved, and I almost cried. I had died such an unjust death. I hadn't even had the time to destroy all of my precious books in my old residence. If word of this got out, wouldn't my reputation be completely ruined? However, Cavendish was probably the most regretful and helpless about the current situation. Not only did he lose the chance to go out and have fun, he hadn't even caused a huge ruckus. He was probably quite unwilling to accept this. In the end, the result of both of us hurting each other was that neither of us was happy. We both kept our mouths shut and ignored each other, just like before. The one in front of me looks rather familiar. That pitiful female, ghost whose stomach had exploded, was actually viciously glaring at me. Keep looking at me, keep looking at me. If you keep looking at me, I'm going to eat you. The river Styx was quite dangerous. Undead souls would constantly lose their memories and sense of self in the river Styx. Simply speaking, it would be a constant -1 in intelligence. In the end, the only things left behind would be their deepest obsessions. And even these obsessions would continuously disappear as the cycle of reincarnation continued. Such chaotic undead souls would also make it easier for the cycle of reincarnation, as well as for the current judgment of the Hades. Logically speaking, we had died quite pitifully this time. Our souls had been soaked in the river Styx for almost an entire month, so the river Styx should have turned us into idiots. But it seemed that our souls had died far too many times and had developed a resistance to the river Styx. The end result was that only the two of us were chatting amongst the confused dead. Ilmigia, or Leona, you died such a pitiful death. Cavendish's sudden scream startled me. It was truly such a coincidence that I met an old acquaintance. However, that female ghost ignored Cavendish and kept staring at me. Could it be that she was one of them? I took a closer look at her and discovered that I had mistaken her for someone else. Her skin color, face shape, and hair color are completely different. Do you think that I'm an idiot? Did I scare you? You're still feeling guilty, aren't you? Keep feeling guilty, Leona. You died such a pitiful death. We continued to hurt each other as we followed the group. Suddenly, light appeared in front of us. The Tower of Holy Light, which was supposed to guide the dead, was now paying attention to us. The mountain path also became much easier to walk on. Perhaps they had discovered me. Roland, You designed this, didn't you? Do you know what will happen to us next? Are there any loopholes? Even Cavendish was hesitating now. It would seem that he had also been greatly frightened by the divine laws. I smiled in delight. I had been waiting for this day for far too long. Of course, there aren't any loopholes. I personally created this judgment system. It's absolutely, foundationally impossible for there to be any loopholes. Even if the judges want to go easy on us, they won't be able to. For some reason, the more I talked about it, the sadder I felt. Although I was quite proud of my judgment system, it seemed that I had once again broken a new record of shooting myself in the foot. A punishment of more than 200 years in the Inferno. It's also possible that I'll be randomly assigned to the beast path during my reincarnation. Yep, don't look at others. I'm talking about you, Cavendish Mist. Whenever I was in a bad mood, it would be better to share it with someone else. Although I reckoned that even if my punishment was light, it would still be limited. Elmigia, this time I wasn't mistaken. That female soul who had a satisfied expression like a saint was being enveloped in a pink glow as she sunk into the ground. It would seem that she was going to serve her sentence in the Inferno of Lust, one of the 7 infernos. In the Inferno of Hades, the amount of light represented the weight of the person's crime. Judging from how she was as bright as a lighthouse, this female soul would be serving at least 100 years. Meow, so scary. Can I cancel my contract with her now? The cat-shaped ghost that had been sleeping on my head all this while yawned. I did some calculations and felt that this cat sentence would probably be even longer than Cavendish's. TSK, I told you to cancel your contract earlier, but you refused. It's too late now, my dear cellmate. Please take care of me in the future. Actually, most of my and Harlow's crimes were related to murder and deceit. It was quite likely that we would be serving our sentences in the same inferno. Finally, we reached the end of the mountain path. When we arrived at the main hall of the judgment hall, even I couldn't help but suck in a cold breath when I saw that familiar figure with emotionless eyes. Sinner Roland, your crimes are to be investigated. 50 years later, in a certain level of the Inferno of Hades. Bail? Using meritorious deeds to atone for your crimes? There's no such rule in the laws of the Inferno of Hades that I created. I refuse to accept this. I want to appeal. This is a black-hearted civil servant who can't use public power for private purposes. Stop giving me so much trouble. I'll find an opportunity to let you out. Do you really think it's easy for us? It took so much effort to pass a new law amendment that allows those who have served more than half their sentences to atone for their crimes. Stop making trouble for me. Ale rubbed his forehead. This bastard in front of him really knew how to make trouble for him. Even if he died, there would be so much trouble. Just how many times had those 2 insane women tried to attack the Inferno of Hades to break out of prison? Yet those 2 insane women had returned from the outside world, becoming even stronger than before. Just one person was in prison, yet he had to worry about the entire prison being blown up into the sky. This was truly too much of a dilemma. Also, that blockhead Womians had no concept of human emotions at all. In the end, it was only because this matter was too important that they passed such a meaningless amendment to the Inferno of Hades. For the sake of the entire world, the Inferno's prison guards could entrust those who had served more than half their sentences to make up for it. Why was it meaningless? In normal situations, not only would the prison guards have no need to ask the prisoners for help, the souls who had served their sentences to a certain extent would have long since lost their sense of self and reincarnated into the cycle of reincarnation. Besides, we really do have something for you to do, and this is something that only you two are capable of doing. I fell silent. Why would the Inferno of Hades come looking for us? I had long since retired and should be enjoying my old age. Right now, all I needed to do was wait for my sentence to end so that I could return to the cycle of reincarnation. Aichi, we need to find Aichi. You probably don't know this, but Aichi has also joined the Guardian of Intelligent Life contract. Since the god Aichi has received a lot of attention, He's been viewed as the magical civilization with the greatest potential in the past 1,000 years. After all, he's the original civilization of the 12 pillar gods. In order to have more authority in the guardian of intelligent life, and for the future of Eichi's civilization, we need Mother Eichi. And then Ale said a lot. It would seem that he had been under too much pressure recently, causing the originally cold and cool young man to swiftly go through menopause like a naggy uncle. The general gist of what he meant was that the 12 pillar gods had long since vanished from the universe, and the civilizations that had obtained the pillar god support and inheritance were all mega-civilizations that were capable of traversing the entire universe. The current Eichi was still quite young, but the tallest of trees had already attracted the attention of many. That was why we needed a truly powerful ally. In the end, the gods and the Hades had done their research and decided to definitely send out little tadpoles to find their mothers. I meant send out the children of fate to find Eichi. Why me? Of course. You're carrying Her Highness Astria, aren't you? Don't think that we don't know that she's the Elven Empress, the goddess of creation. Being imprisoned to such an extent is... I'm so envious. Of course, the one who said such a thing wasn't Ale. Instead, it was Cavendish who had an expression of jealousy and envy. Cavendish was probably the most pitiful of all. The Inferno also had additional punishments for playboys. One such punishment included a meeting with his ex-girlfriends. I meant a meeting for revenge. Cavendish's 4-digit lovers were simultaneously transformed into virtual souls by the power of the dimensional laws and revived. That bitter charaba was truly delightful. I didn't know what happened to the people involved, but at the very least I watched it as a comedy. Yep, it was especially so when they were cut into more than 4,000 pieces by knives and forks, and then each person had a piece to eat. It was truly delightful. If I had the chance, I would definitely write a new novel about this to warn those who are already in the game. Justice will always descend from the heavens. Cough, cough! Getting back to the main topic, in the end, due to the existence of a certain goddess within me, it seemed that I was the most likely existence to find Eichi. Ale and the others used this reason to convince Wumians to end my sentence early. I fell silent as I mysteriously hesitated. Actually, I don't want to go out. This wasn't a lie. I really didn't want to go out. At the very least, I obtained the peace that I desired here. If you don't go out, we'll let those 2 crazy women in here to accompany you. I fell silent as I recalled Cavendish's pitiful state that day. I couldn't help but shiver. Roland, I miss my mother. Astria's words caused me to hesitate. That was because I now owed her a favor. Roland, I want a child, a real child, a healthy living child. The blonde young girl behind me suddenly hugged me. Her sudden outburst of words scared me so much that I almost spat on AL's face. Cough, cough! Can a soul be choked to death? Harloise, what nonsense are you saying? However, her calm expression conveyed her determination to me. Without a physical body, she would naturally have no descendants. She was unwilling to accept this. Actually, I was even more unwilling to accept this. It had already been more than 400 years. My pitiful life as a great mage had probably broken Eichi's historical record. I had to erase this part. I definitely couldn't let anyone know about this part. I definitely couldn't be recorded in history with such a title. I had to complete my own life. All right, I agree. But I don't have a physical body right now. You guys need to prepare for this. I'm confident that I can retain my memories and sense of self after reincarnation. However, my physical body needs to have a sufficiently powerful bloodline. Otherwise, it'll be so tiring to start all over again. Don't worry about this. They've long since prepared for this. I guarantee that you'll be satisfied. They? In the future, what I regretted the most was that I didn't investigate who they were. 1 year later, a certain gynecologist department in a certain hospital on Earth became the focus of many fanatics. The head gynecologist of this hospital hadn't slept for 2 entire days. After all, the child that was about to give birth was the offspring of an alien species, the wood spirits and the humans of Earth. Let's not mention how many people cursed the lucky man who married a wood spirit, how many people tried to break his third leg, and how many people tried to change the law to send the person who dared to touch a legal young girl to prison. But as an outstanding species of interstellar diplomats, the cute and intelligent wood spirits easily gained the favor of outsiders. After several decades of interaction, they gained countless fans from Earth. And after this mixed-blood child was discovered to be a twin, he received even more blessings and expectations from countless people. And then the child's father received a hammer and blade that broke all previous records. Although there were precedents of mixed-blood children between HE humans and wood spirits, and although scientists repeatedly guaranteed that humans from Earth and HE humans were essentially the same genetically, the doctors still didn't dare to let down their guard at all. They took turns to be on duty 24 hours a day until the child was unexpectedly born ahead of schedule. Where is this place? I woke up from my daze, but my question turned into a loud infant's cry. The familiar, yet foreign Chinese from Earth instantly helped me understand where I was. I am back again. I was in a daze and was now back in my homeland. I sighed emotionally. HE's past was like a dream that had shattered behind me. Everything had to start anew. Haha. I've had enough of living without the internet or television. Finally, I, Roland, the king of games, have returned. Wait a moment. A young body has the intelligence of an adult? Isn't this the traditional story of reincarnation? Can't I just copy songs, books, and inventions to date school beauties? Could it be that my misfortune has truly ended, and that someone else has written the script of fate? I laughed even louder as I thought about this. And in the eyes of the mother of the young girl who was lying on the bed, her healthy eldest son was full of energy and had such a pure and cute smile. I could also faintly sense a familiar soul beside me. As expected, that little bastard had followed me here as well. After all, in a way, we were inseparable. It seems that I've won. I'm still the older brother. My foolish younger brother. Watch how I'm going to take care of you. I could sense that my life force was slightly stronger than his. It seemed that I had been born slightly earlier than him. What an excellent pair of twins. You're truly fortunate. I instantly started trembling. She seemed to be a young nurse. I did my best to raise my head in despair and struggled to look at the inside of my legs. However, not only was I unable to move at all, how could an infant who didn't even have the ability to sense light clearly see the outside world? Handsome older brother, you have to properly protect your younger sister in the future. I gently rubbed my cheek with my lips. This old woman was actually trying to take advantage of me, but I wouldn't argue with her. At this moment, I was instantly satisfied and almost cried tears of joy. Meanwhile, on the other side, I could even sense a certain unlucky fellow's despair. She was struggling and wriggling as she hugged the foot of the bed and did her best to raise her head. Could it be that she intended to ram her head into the baby bed and die? Little sister, are you hungry? Give me the baby. Unfortunately, the mischievous little sister had been discovered and then given to the little girl mother to feed. At this moment, Cavanwen's despair was truly delightful. I felt heartache. Yep, no matter what, I was still an older brother, so I should treat my younger sister better. At the same time, I heaved a sigh of relief. Outside the window, a pregnant woman was being pushed into the delivery room, and my magical pet contract was activated once again. It would seem that a certain cat had successfully reincarnated into a human. Wait a moment. Let's hope that she didn't get the wrong gender. If she did, just imagining the scene would be unbearable. I was straight after all. I kept feeling like something was off. Normally, souls would have their own color, and normal people wouldn't get it wrong even if they reincarnated. Wasn't Cavendish being a bit too unlucky? Have you named them yet? The young nurse hugged me. Her ample breast seemed rather familiar. Ahem. I was probably rather hungry, but I still needed to have a bottom line. Where was the milk bottle? The older one's name is Roland, and the younger one's name is Cavinci. Not only was I frightened, even Cavinci was so frightened that she forgot to cry. Aren't they going to use their father's surname? I recall that their father's surname is Jiang. Yep, these two children are quite fortunate. They received the blessings of our species' main god. Mother Goddess Amelia even decided to become their godmother. She was the one who came up with their names. The young mother's words were filled with pride. Being able to have the long-retired Goddess Amelia become their godmother was the happiest moment of her life. Wah! Wah! As for the two babies, they started crying at the same time. They were so scared. Actually, they weren't crying at all. Rather, they were arguing in baby language. You scammer, Roland. You dragged me down with you. How many times has it been already? How can you blame me for this? This is clearly the world's evil intentions. All right then, the world had been shot once again. However, the two energetic babies caused the young mother to misunderstand. Little babies, are you happy? There's even more to come. Godmother even said that she'll personally come here to bless you. The two babies instantly stopped crying and simultaneously started struggling in an attempt to escape this dangerous area. Unfortunately, the newborns didn't have enough strength. After struggling for a while, they were still unable to move in the nurse's and young mother's arms. The nurse's braided hair fell on my face. It felt itchy, yet strangely familiar. I instinctively reached out to grab it, but what I touched was smooth silver hair. By the way, you can't stay here with two babies, right? Can someone help you take care of them? My internship is about to end, so I probably won't be able to stay in the hospital. Why don't I be your nanny and help you take care of your children for a while? I've learned nursing before. That was strange. Why did this voice sound so familiar? That's wonderful. Thank you. The young mother had been worried that it would be difficult for her to do chores due to her short hands. Now that someone was helping her take care of her children, she was overjoyed. Only now did she remember that she didn't even remember I Ching's name. Eliza Mist. I'm a Russian, mixed blood. Please take care of me. At that moment, I felt as if that warm embrace had become the firmest prison. It tightened, really tightened. At this moment, I didn't know where to run. At this moment, a familiar voice came from outside the door. Where's my little son? Bring him over so that Godmother can kiss him. Little Roland, you're so cute. Come, call me Mommy. My vision instantly darkened. Where's the crib? Just let me bang myself to death.